Buonasera, benvenuti alla seconda
Good
sessione.
evening, everybody, and welcome to the second session of this Congress organized by the Guido d'Arezzo Foundation and the Guidonian Center of Studies, Music Editing, Music Encoding, and Performance Practice. We'll start with this second session today with the topic the digital humanities and digital editions of music. Our chair for today will be Stefano Mengozzi from the University of Michigan, and I'm giving the floor to him.
Everyone in the old world, and good morning to all of us across the ocean. My name is Stefano Mengozzi. I'm speaking from Ann Arbor, Michigan in the US, and I am honored to chair this session on the digital humanities. You will hear 3 presentations today on 2 cutting-edge and award-winning projects that illustrate the impressive potential of digital technology at the service of musical editions and musicological research. The first 2 speakers will describe for us the first project called Citations, the Renaissance Imitation Mass, or CRIM. They will begin with a joined introduction, and then they will focus on specific aspects of the CRIM site individually. The third speaker will illustrate the Tasso in Music project. Just a practical matter, please use the chat function to ask questions. I will be reading them and I will air them. I will pass the questions to our speakers. Now, without further ado, I will introduce the first 2 speakers. Richard Friedman is Professor of Music, John C. Whitehead 43, Professor of Humanities, and Associate Provost at Haverford College, near Philadelphia in the US. His recent work includes Music in the Renaissance, 2 volumes, Norton 2012, and a pair of innovative projects that use digital tools to explore Renaissance repertories. The Lost Voices Project and Citations, the Renaissance Imitation Mass that you will be hearing about today. He has served as digital and multimedia scholarship editor for the Journal of the American Musicological Society. He's been the chair of the Digital Technology Committee for the AMS and chair of the Digital and Electronic Media Committee for the Renaissance Society of America. Friedman is also a frequent pre-concert lecturer for the Philadelphia Orchestra and the Philadelphia Chamber Music Society. His More Than Mozart, a series of recorded lectures for those interested to be better listeners. Yes. Excuse me, there's an interference here. His More Than Mozart, a series of recorded lectures for those interested to be better listeners, is available on CD and various streaming formats. And again, the first contribution will be joined with Dr. Rafael Villanti, who is a research programmer at the Maryland Institute for Technology in the Humanities, MITH, at the University of Maryland in the US. Dr. Villanti holds a PhD in digital musicology from the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College, London, where he also contributed to several major digitization and text encoding projects. Rafael's research is grounded in digital humanities and textual scholarship, where text includes musical notation. More specifically, he seeks to advance textual scholarship by finding new and efficient practices to coherently and digitally model and edit text and music notation sources as digital scholarly resources. Raffaele is currently an elected member of the Text Encoding Initiative Technical Council and the technical editor of the Scholarly Editing Journal. Please welcome Professor Friedman and Dr. Villanti. Now you can continue with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefano. It's an honor to be here with Raffaele and an honor to be part of this very important conference, meet new colleagues and see familiar ones as well. I'll just share my screen so that we can begin our first short presentation. There we are. Can you confirm that you can see the image? Yeah? Great.
Okay. Yes.
So our first short presentation we'll call The Story of a Soggetto. And you can see that there's a link here on the very first slide with which you can follow these slides or review them later on your own. I'll just leave this up for a moment. We can put it in the chat too. Just a few themes to think about as we begin. Some concepts that we'll talk about involve the crossings of various frontiers that are perhaps both familiar and unfamiliar. So digital editions are at the edge of the graphical and the logical. We'll come back to explain this in a few minutes. They combine aspects of practical editions as well as scholarly editions. They can be both fixed and dynamic. They can involve opportunities for discovery as well as citation. And interestingly, as we'll see in some of the projects that we'll encounter this morning and this afternoon, they can involve both close reading, very detailed examination of scores, and also distant reading, where we consider an entire corpus at the same time. And then finally, they involve new opportunities and new obligations, we would argue, for sustainable approaches to music editions, whether they're in PDF format or XML technologies, something that we'll talk about in a few minutes. So these are just some large ideas to think about as we move ahead. One of the things that we often do as music scholars, of course, is make modern editions. Those of us interested in the Renaissance typically move from a source. This is a chanson from the 1540s, by Lupus or Cadillac, Je suis déshérité, a very famous melody and in fact a 4-part piece. And we make modern editions of these. This is made with Sibelius. We turn this into PDF format and can distribute it, print it, share it with people in various ways. So from source to modern edition is an important trajectory that we need to think about. And that, of course, is a digital process, whether we're thinking of scanned images that we derive from important library resources or the software that we use to make these editions. But we can also think about ways to move from Sibelius not just to a flat graphical form of the representation of music, something that is legible and important to musicians, but also what we will call a logical markup or a logical form of this music. And so in the middle we see Sibelius transformed into an XML standard. XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. And this is the basis of much that we encounter on the internet, whether it's shopping on Amazon or reading an encoded text. Extensible markup languages are structured representations of information. So they encode not necessarily the design of a letter that happens to be in boldface or a letter that is underlined, but instead the logical structure of that. That is to say, this is emphasized in some way, or this text is a title. And so an XML technology that we use very heavily for music is called the Music Encoding Initiative. And like the Text Encoding Initiative, TEI, this structure called MEI allows us to represent, as you can see here, in a hierarchical way, a note belongs to a layer of a measure, and the layer of a measure belongs to a staff, and the staff belongs to the larger measure itself. And that structured representation, allows us to present that musical, logical data in a variety of formats. We can transform it through some software called Verovio from that structured representation into another graphical representation that can be put anywhere on the internet. And this is unlike simply a PDF. Now it's something that can be rendered on any device, whether it's your phone or your computer, and itself can be playable, can be turned into a PDF, a whole series of things along the way. So we move from simply presenting texts in flat ways to now logical ways that themselves engender or allow a whole dynamic series of representations. And so here you can see in this representation, not only can we present one note, and you'll see in the highlighted passage of the MEI, one note, which is the note C, right here. Here's the note, sorry, I need to get my pointer back. There, the note C, which is part of a layer, which is part of a staff, which is part of a measure, but we can also attach to that note a critical annotation. And very often when we edit Renaissance music, we have to supply unwritten accidentals, Musica ficta. And this is very much part of what editors normally do when we create graphical texts. And convention dictates that we put these editorial accents above the staff to indicate that we have supplied them and that musicians need to understand when to apply them and perhaps when to use their own judgment. And we can do this very easily with Sibelius or with PDFs, but with MEI, we can actually mark in a logical way the status of that accidental as having been supplied, why it was supplied, and indeed we could even attach to this information about who supplied it, so that we can understand the layering of editorial interventions in a particular text. And moreover, we can treat this dynamically, showing the piece with or without the accidental, collating a great number of such accidentals to understand where they appear, and otherwise explore not only the details of one piece, but the details of many pieces. Raffaele, would you like to say anything about this or the next slide as we move along?
Yeah, well, no, not quite yet. I think you covered everything. Maybe I will just simply add that here we're seeing one specific type of sort of what Richard called a critical annotation. There are other aspects of sort of the editorial work that you can model using MEI. For example, if you are transcribing a primary source that might happen to be manuscript or a source that is being annotated on paper, you can rely on certain elements to identify and distinguish, text that it is in the source versus text that is being added and written in a different hand. So while here we're looking at, the editor supplying X information, we can also describe, changes that might have happened on the page on the source as we continue editing it.
Great. Here's another example of the kind of editorial intervention that we often take as scholars, that is producing critical editions. So in this case, we have one piece in which there are three different witnesses, three different sources. We have chosen a lemma, which is very typical. There's a particular reading, and you can see in the top right hand of the page, the lemma is this reading that's at the top. But we've also supplied readings that are available in two other prints, slight rhythmic and melodic variants, and these too have been encoded in MEI. And in fact, we can create either a graphical version of the piece that simply supplies the lemma and leaves the encoded version to contain the critical information, or we can actually create something that no graphical PDF edition or printed page could ever do, which is to allow the user to reconfigure the edition according to their choice. So it doesn't just show the other readings, but it allows the user to select from among these. And of course, I can't do this on the presentation slide, but another time you could go to the link that's there and actually click to reconfigure bar by bar your particular edition. So this now starts to invert some of the habits that we think of, which is as readers or as musicians, normally we simply consume editions that are offered us by editors or producers of the material. In the digital environment, in effect, each user can become an editor and choose their own adventure, as it were. So this is another way in which digital texts allow a kind of dynamic possibility that simply graphical texts cannot. And of course, we could also step back from this single piece to think about many pieces together, because since the encodings here are structured in a very regular way, one could actually look at dozens or even hundreds of compositions simultaneously and explore which sources agreed with which other sources across many pieces simultaneously. Normally, this is the kind of information that is contained at the back of a critical edition, and users need to work through those annotations to reconstruct the story of the relationship between sources or the story of the dissemination of a particular composition. Here in the digital environment, the structured nature of the encodings means that that information doesn't need to be imprisoned at the end of an edition, but instead could be open to interrogation in all kinds of ways. Another thing that we can do with this material is to imagine new ways of citing pieces. Currently, when we think about quoting a particular melody or mentioning an effect that happens in a piece that we think is notable, we have certain standards that we agree upon as musicians. We talk about certain measure numbers or perhaps voice parts. And of course, we all know as individual musicians how to find one or another score and find what we assume to be the same place. If we're talking about a Beethoven piano sonata, each person will look up their own edition and discover where a particular passage in a particular measure might be. But digital texts inaugurate new possibilities for citing not just general level containers in these measures, in that voice part, in this piece, but each individual note, by virtue of those structured encodings that we mentioned before, each individual note has its own digital address. And you could see some of this in the images that we saw just a moment ago, where at this moment of the supplied accidental, there's something called an XML ID. And this is a unique number, of course, unintelligible to a human being, but meaningful to a machine. I've suppressed the XML IDs from the other levels of notes here just for simplicity's sake. But the point is that each note in an example, each note in a score actually has its own address. And so Raffaele has devised a universal standard, a specification that we refer to as the Enhancing Music Addressability Standard, that allows us to cite any note in any score anywhere on the internet and return that as a meaningful encapsulation of encoded music and use it where we like. And Raffaele, would you like to say something about this standard and its power or its possibilities?
Yes, definitely. So, here we're looking at one specific way of representing music notation digitally, that is the Music Encoding Initiative. But in fact, there exists a number of various different ways of representing music information digitally. And I think we may see a few examples of this later on today. But essentially, we don't have really at the moment a simple way to refer to specific parts of these digital representations. if we operate with PDFs or images, and I will say a little bit more about this in my section, then you're essentially working with something that the computer understands exclusively as a graphical format. So you can refer to specific areas of that surface, but you can't really sort of talk about specific components of the music notation because the computer has no understanding of it when it's working with a graphical representation such as a PDF or an image. But once it's represented in MEI or in other formats that are meant to represent the logical structure, then we can start addressing specific parts of that notation so that we can we can attach something to it. And computers are pretty apt at working with textual strings, for example. So if you have a website or a document, it is simple enough, and I'm sure you've done this, to sort of drag your mouse and select a portion of text, right? Computers are very good at doing that. But when it comes to music notation, because just to begin with, we have this kind of grid-like structure at the very least, right? Where you have both sort of time and multiple sort of voices and instruments. Then it is not as simple to make that selection. So this system that we devised is meant to allow us to do that kind of selection so that we can attach further information to it. And because there are multiple ways of representing music, we tried to define it in a way that utilizes sort of musical ideas and concepts rather than references to specific parts of a certain document. Like Richard was showing us that there are IDs that you can use to refer to those different elements in the MEI, but other specifications may do it differently, or those IDs may not be there because they're optional. So we use concepts like sort of measures and instruments and sort of even beat values to instead address these portions of text from a more abstract perspective. And then we rely on software to go and resolve that selection to actually go and figure out where it needs to go on the file.
Great. So this structure here involves, if you think of the reference as being from the smallest level up, is in yellow certain beats, and then in green in certain staves, and then in red in certain measures. There are notes that I find interesting or important, and that reference can be resolved according to the particular representation, as Raffaele said, of the piece, and then return exactly those notes. So this is what then inaugurates a new kind of quotable text for music, where we could actually speak of note level references, bringing them together either to highlight them, as we've done here in an analytic context in the CRIM project, or in fact to gather them all together as a series of proof texts and perhaps compute something to do with their similarity or their affinities or their differences. It would be something like a musical commonplace book where you could gather up many, many instances of features that you thought important and then produce them on the web or use them as part of some other process. And we'll return to this page, which is from the CRIM project, to talk a little bit about it later. But this, in a small encapsulation, explains the concept that's at hand here, which is to say we have an MEI score and it resides on the internet. We create a selection, and that reference uses the enhancing notation addressability, music notation addressability system to find those particular notes in a representation and returns the score or an MEI encoding of the score to something like Verovio, which is a piece of software that renders it on any device, and then in the context of a particular project presents the score and the highlighted notes that you originally chose in this new graphical form. But there's more that we can do, because that same valid MEI can also be sent to a variety of other renderers. And in fact, one of the things that we can do in CRIM is not only represent these examples, but we can play them. They can be rendered in MIDI or in MP3. And so we now have not only graphical examples for music, but audible examples for music. And this is a powerful and new environment that we find ourselves in. We could go to a whole series of examples for this particular soggetto, which we'll come back to in the context of the CRIM project. But just to show you here that there are many ways, I think I would probably need to reshare my screen. But hundreds of dozens of examples of that particular soggetto that we could go to in the context of the CRIM project. But I'll pause here, and perhaps there'll be questions before we move on to learn about the CRIM project in a little more detail.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Raffaele. Indeed, if there are questions about the content you have heard thus far, please use the chat function to convey the question to us. Perhaps one question I may have is, all this is so impressive, is so promising, in fact, in so many ways for both researchers and performers. What is the frontier at this point? What would you like? Perhaps this is clearly a layman's question, but that's the way I feel about all this. What is the next stage in technological advancement that you would like to be able to do and you're not able to at this stage?
Well, I would say that probably the impediment at this point is not so much technological. These things are fairly robust and fairly reliable. I'd say the next challenges are social, because all of these things depend on collaboration. No one can do them on their own. I require Raffaele's help, and we both require the help of data scientists, developers, and others to produce this material. And I'm sure Emiliano's experiences are very similar. And this involves new disciplinary intersections and collaborations for musicology and for musicians. And I think the prospect of spreading digital experience and digital competence and platforms for collaboration among all of us who are interested in various repertories, that is where the frontier is. For musicology, I would say that this is the new interdisciplinarity. 30 years ago, it was about connections with literary scholarship, historical scholarship, art history, and other fields, philosophical or aesthetic fields. And those are no less important to the work of musicologists, but I'd say the new interdisciplinarity is the connection with data science, computer development, and as I'll say in the CRIM project, I mean, in some ways what's happening is music is going back to where it was in the Middle Ages. It's among the quadrivium and no longer just in the trivium. Something maybe that Guido would have appreciated.
Have you seen applications of this technology? Some concrete fruits of this technology in scholarly endeavors out there, or do you think they are coming?
Of Emiliano's work, the work of Jesse Roden and the Josken Research Project, resources of the sort that Raffaele has helped to compile. The English ballad, early English ballad archive is another great example of this. I'm interested in my work. Karen Desmond, interested in 13th and 14th century music. There's a great deal of interest in early music for this. Before the book is somehow resonant with a period that is after the book, I think is the moment that we're entering into. But of course, there's a Mozart digital edition that's using MEI. Bach scholars are using MEI. And MEI is not the only technology. There are many others using new technologies to create sustainable texts. I think is the key thing. The key figure here is to think about what I call the acid-free paper of the digital age. Yes, we can create digital editions, and yes, we can share them on IMSLP or the Choral Music Library. But when we share them through PDF, they have a ubiquity to them, but they are not necessarily sustainable in the sense of the labor that went into them being reusable. And one of the key features of XML or other open encodings of the sort that Emiliano and that we all use is that they are something like what I call a palimpsest of the digital age. Because I can add information to a text that Emiliano has created without erasing Emiliano's work. It's infinitely adaptable, but also infinitely recoverable. And that's the key feature. And I think given the limitation of resources, the importance, indeed the imperative that we collaborate and share material rather than each do something that we put in our own digital silo, I think is the key question for us moving ahead. That's why I say I think the key challenges are social and disciplinary rather than technological.
Yeah, that's certainly true. This is a model of scholarship that is, of course, is much in use in the hard sciences. We can see these days with all the endeavors to produce a vaccine, but that's only one example. And I guess in the humanities, we are less used to work in that way, but we can see very clearly here what the potential is for that kind of collaboration. Are there any questions? Let's see, be mindful of time. It's 10 o'clock. Richard and Raffaele, do you feel like you have presented your material sufficiently? Maybe, or I guess there will be probably a lot more. I guess I wonder if we should maybe, first of all, do we have to close at 4:30 sharp, Cecilia? Can we keep a few more minutes, take a few more minutes?
Yes.
Yes, meaning we could stretch it to 10:40 or 4:40 or 4:45.
Okay, you can go on.
Okay. In that case, I would ask Richard and Raffaele to maybe take another 10 minutes, and then we can save about 20 minutes for Emiliano, and then we can have a closing discussion for about 10, 15 minutes. Would that be reasonable?
Sure, I could just say a very few things because I want Raffaele to be able to speak to these larger issues. So I'll just say very briefly what we are trying to do with the CRIM project just for a few minutes and then move on to Raffaele quickly. Is that okay?
Yes, as far as I'm concerned, yes.
Yeah. I will share this screen. This one. So the CRIM project is about the quotable digital text in a digital age. It's about the Renaissance imitation mass, illusion, and similarity in music. And the key moment here, and you could go back to these slides, which we'll share the link later, and listen to these. In fact, I think Paolo was in the conference yesterday, I believe. I hope he's here today, but this happens to be a recording from his own group. Very typical in the Renaissance, there's a large genre of masses, cyclic settings of the ordinary of the Catholic Mass that are based upon a French chanson or a madrigal or a motet in which a very short piece, let's say 2 minutes, has been extended to be a cycle of something like 20 minutes in ways that have involved interlocking musical ideas, shifting in time and space, reworking of old sounds and old meanings in new contexts. And the CRIM project is the successor in terms of digital technology to the Lost Voices project, where we explored similar concepts, both digitally and musically. And in some ways, the digital, as I've been suggesting, is a very appropriate thing to be doing in the moment, because if we think back to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the idea of music as number or notation as a kind of encoding of sound, and above all, of counterpoint as an art of combinations, is absolutely key to the idiom. And the digital environment allows us to track these in very remarkable ways. We both work closely, hand in hand. Young Italian scholar Alessandra Iniesti on the right, David Fiala, my colleague at Tours, an American PhD student, Ian Lawrence. These are participants in CRIM, who we call criminels in France, are working both up close and, as you can see at the right, a representation of many, many hundreds of observations simultaneously that tell us about preferences and patterns. All of this is made possible with MEI. We gather together original sources of the chanson, shown on the left, and the mass on the right, encode them in MEI, then consider them through the prism of vocabulary of musical types and relationship types. This is all done by human beings, and then include all of this material in a large database and a space for discussion. So as an example, here is a pattern from Josquin's famous Ave Maria, in which the same musical idea recurs at precise intervals, each an octave apart from each other. We call this a periodic entry, using the vocabulary of Peter Schubert. We could listen to this, but I'm trying to save time here. The same motive is reworked in a mass by Josquin's contemporary Antoine de Fevin, with a different melodic relationship and a different temporal relationship. So as you can see, instead of the time interval being 2 breves and the octave or unison below, it's 5 semi-breves and an octave above. And this is basic to the language of Renaissance counterpoint. Everyone knows about these, but it's impossible to control more than a few. And so our CRIM database includes thousands of these observations in very detailed ways, including both the musical citations, using MEI, using EMA, that's the red notes here, as well as human-made observations about the specific patterns that are at hand. And so we have a large vocabulary that explains the musical concepts, and analysts learn each of these stereotypical patterns to recognize them. We've now even taught machines, computer algorithms, to recognize these patterns, and this will be the next frontier for us, is confirming and confronting what machines find with what humans find. And then putting these all together in a large database that allows us to see many, many instances of connections between various pieces. And this is a typical page from the CRIM resource that brings together passages observed by people with metadata concerning them, and then larger relationships that allow us to see hundreds of connections between the same pieces simultaneously. So I will pause here. That's just a very quick introduction to CRIM. And I should also say that CRIM is an active project currently supported by a large grant from the American Council of Learned Societies, and in partnership both with Haverford College and the Center for Advanced Study of the Renaissance in Tours. And we are actively looking for analyst participants and scholars and students to take part in this work through conferences, and actually for compensated paid work during the next 2 years. So if you're at all interested in this project, you should by all means be in touch with me.
Ok, sarò brevissimo, e preferirei parlare in italiano perché è un'opportunità che non mi capita molto spesso.
I'll be very brief and I'll speak Italian. In fact, I won't be speaking about Crim much because I think that, well, I do realize that the theme of this symposium is different. We want to talk about musical practice. what we call performance and performance practice, and in relation to digital editions. I think it's an important fact. When we talk about the use of these resources, uh, it is a type of use which is more analytic. But in the case of musical practice, what can we do? What can we consider the factors which are to be analyzed from this point of view? I would like to make a distinction between access and use, which go together with the distinction between uh, PDF and codified scores. And the access that I want to access is that of being able to access and reach these scores and look at them online. And one of the things where I can do it, especially regarding these, are the digital libraries, those that are connected to national libraries. This is,
L'audio che non sento, scusate.
Posso parlare anche più, posso alzare la voce.
yes, he has to raise his voice a bit. In actual fact, there are about 150,000 scores, and they're mainly primary sources. So it's a way of accessing these sources in a digital format, which have made they're essential for the researcher and for the musician who wants to, who's interested in the historical situation around a repertoire that we're studying. And there also are digital libraries, for instance, the New York Philharmonic archives that have primary sources of different types. For instance, this is a score, you see, and here you can see it's been the notes are by Leonard Bernstein, famous orchestra director, and then there are sites like ISMP or CPDL, but others too, the Lester Levy collection, for instance, where you can find uh, DPF formats or images of scores that often are copied and are greatly used in order to be able to obtain uh, scores to be able to play them again. And often what happens is that once these scores are reached, so now I'm going to the actual use, they're printed before being played. So the use of the digital in this sense is exclusively to obtain more quickly the score, which will then be studied or played. So, from the commercial point of view, there are other uh, publishing houses that have started to look into this paradigm and make it possible to unload the PDF of a score to then print it. And then, in fact, the digital format can't even be distributed at that point. So basically, it's like buying the score normally, and you can have access immediately. But it's becoming more normal because of the widespread capacity in using computers, smartphones, and tablets of different levels. We can see that these are being taken directly from one's uh, computers, or you can immediately see that often they're playing directly from an iPad, but always using the PDF format. So the main advantage in using a digital score is for the ease to carry it around a larger number of scores instead of using the masses of printed copies. But when we create a digital mm, editions like Crim, how could these be used in the service of musical practice? And this becomes a bit more complicated because often, at least for those that exist today, the interest is much more one of research. For instance, we see the notes that we've done with Crim are analytical and they're they're useful for the musical practice, but it's not possible from the website to play directly, use these scores. And so CRIM, in fact, includes also PDFs which can be printed for that use, which is rather essential. And this is an edition of Mozart that we mentioned just a while ago. This too has dynamic factors, but it doesn't make it easy to play using this. I mean, if you try and switch pages, it takes too long. So it's still focalized for research, basically. Okay, so how can we solve these situations? Well, in my opinion, this is a moment or a point of frontier because the digital uses available now have not yet thought of how they can actually be used for music. And I'm going back to what Hans Viering was saying in in the multidimensional model he suggests, and he says that the digital edition has a large number of data, both from the point of view of editions, primary sources, critical notes, connections, and external resources, but also multimedia representations. And the application which is constructed on these allows to cut slices, so to speak, two-dimensional slices are more stable, which are achieved by this complex apparatus, and can create visualizations which are more stable and can be used and printed for the performance, or can be visualized on an iPad for the performance. Well, I think this is about it. We don't have much time, but this was an idea that I wanted to bring you for the discussion. How can we use these resources which we are creating in the service of music?
Thank you so much, Rafael. There's a lot of food for thought here that we may also continue debating during the roundtable after this session. Um, is there maybe a quick question now for Rafael or even for Richard before we move on to the next speaker? Okay, I don't see any questions coming from the chat. In that case, I will introduce Professor Ricciardi, who is Professor Emiliano Ricciardi, is Assistant Professor of Music History at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He holds a PhD from Stanford University, completed in 2013, with the support of an ACLS Mellon Fellowship, and an MPhil from the University of Cambridge, England. His main research area is the late Italian madrigal, with an emphasis on the settings of Torquato Tasso's poetry. Ricciardi has published articles and reviews in journals such as Early Music, Journal of Musicology, Cambridge Opera Journal, Renaissance Quarterly. He has two volumes forthcoming. He's the author of a monograph entitled Singing Lyric Poetry in the Late Cinquecento, The Musical Legacy of Torquato Tasso's Rime, and editor of the collection Qual Musico Gentil, New Perspectives on Torquato Tasso and Early Modern Music, both forthcoming from Brepols, and we certainly look forward to those contributions. Welcome, Emiliano. Please illustrate the site now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for this very kind introduction, and special thanks, of course, to Cecilia Luzzi and to the Fondazione for organizing this very stimulating event, despite all the difficulties that we all know. I will try to be as brief as possible so that we can move on to the roundtable. As Stefano pointed out, there are lots of issues that are worth discussing. So one of the distinctive features of the Italian madrigal is that it is as much about poetry as it is about music. Composers would often respond to the literary taste of their milieus by engaging in sophisticated renditions of poems by notable authors, ranging from Petrarch to Marino. This poetry frequently had a distinguished textual tradition of its own, being widely disseminated through literary manuscripts and prints even before it was set to music. This strong literary component is typically underrepresented in critical editions of the madrigal repertoire. These are often devoted to the works of single composers as opposed to settings of the same poetry by multiple composers, and feature critical apparatuses that rarely engage with the complex textual traditions of the poems set to music. This approach to making critical editions of Italian madrigals is a function also of the limitations of the printed medium, which typically does not allow for complex apparatuses engaging with both the musical and the literary tradition. Furthermore, the printed medium has historically been resistant to collaboration, which is instead desirable, especially between musicologists and literary scholars, given the interdisciplinary nature of the genre. Drawing on the possibilities afforded by digital encoding, the Tasso Music Project, the first complete edition of the early modern musical settings of poetry by Torquato Tasso, provides a different approach to editing Italian madrigals and related genres. Indeed, the project is poet-centered and devotes equal attention to the musical and poetic realms, thanks also to collaboration between music and literary scholars. The goal of this presentation is to provide an overview of the repertoire under investigation and, most importantly, to illustrate digital features that allow users of the Tasso Music Project fully to appreciate the interdisciplinary nature of its repertoire. These features include musical and literary encodings, as well as tools for the analysis of music-text relationships. There is no need to say this before this audience, but where I work, it's always worth repeating. Tasso was arguably the most prominent poet of late 16th century Italy. His poems rapidly became a source of inspiration for composers, resulting in the production between the 1570s and the 1630s of over 750 settings. Please note that I'm referring to direct settings of Tasso's poetry as opposed to operatic adaptations of Jerusalem, which is another business, so to speak. But as is typical with repertoire from this period, and we all know how serious this issue is, most of the settings, over 3/4, have not been available in modern edition. As a result, this significant corpus of works has remained largely unexplored in both scholarship and performance, which is in turn hindered a serious assessment of Tasso's influence on early modern musical culture. So, funded by a 3-year scholarly editions and translations grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Tasso Music Project fills this lacuna through a complete digital edition of the extant settings of Tasso's poetry, carried out by a team of musicologists, literary scholars, and digital humanities experts from North America and Europe. And I can start the share screen so that I can, first of all, let you see the list of participants in the project. The theme of collaboration has already come up, and as you can see here, we have a pretty extensive list of participants in this project. Unfortunately, I cannot name them all in the interest of time, but I think it would be interesting also in the roundtable to discuss a little bit more in depth the collaboration between the scholar and the programmer. So in the case of the Tasso project, the relationship that I have, for instance, with Craig Sapp, who is the technical director of the project. In the case of the CREAM project, between Richard and Rafael, which is a very different relationship, I think, from the one you have with a traditional publisher. I would also like to point out, as I said already, that the participants of this project cover a wide spectrum of disciplines, ranging from music history, musicology, to literary studies. So we really brought together an interdisciplinary community of scholars. But how is this very wide repertoire organized? As you can see from the homepage of the website, because it is a poetry-based project, the main way of organizing it is by poem, or rather by type of poem. As you can see, we have 4 separate tabs from rime to other, and they proceed in order, basically from most frequently set to music to least frequently set to music. It's a little bit counterintuitive to see rime before Gerusalemme, because we tend to think of Gerusalemme as Tasso's opus magnum, which is certainly true, but in terms of musical reception, it was not as successful as Tasso's lyric poetry, the rime. And for each poem, we provide a text in modern edition. In the case of the rime, unfortunately, we typically have to rely still on Solerti's edition from the late 19th century, because as some of you may know, we still don't have a complete critical edition of Tasso's lyric poems, and this is quite stunning, but this is the state of affairs in Tasso scholarship, along with newly made translations. For many of these poems, we did not have any English translations whatsoever, so we had to make them entirely from scratch. When other more recent critical editions exist, we of course reference them. In the case of this poem, Non è questa la mano, we do have a very recent excellent edition as part of the Edizione Nazionale delle Opere di Torquato Tasso. We also discussed the attribution of the poems, which is a very thorny issue, especially when it comes to the rime. And I am extremely conservative when it comes to issues of attribution, because it's such a minefield that it's always better to err on the side of caution. In the case of this poem, we don't have this issue because it's safely attributed to him. We have an autograph, etc., etc. We also provide information as to the dating and dedicatees. Just a small note about the dating of this particular poem. Solerti dates it to the early 1560s, presumably when he was in love with Lucrezia Bendidio, but there is no evidence for that. The earliest written testimony of this poem is actually a musical setting by Pallavicino. So this is to show that musical settings actually can tell us a lot about the history of the poetry as well. Likewise, we provide for every poem a complete list of literary sources, both manuscripts and prints, with hyperlinks to digitized exemplars where they exist. And of course, we also provide a comprehensive list of musical settings. In the case of Non è questa la mano, there are quite a few, over 200. This is Tasso's most frequently set poem. Now, when it comes to big data, and here we certainly have big data. We have tons of poems and tons of musical settings. It's important to provide users efficient ways of sorting out the repertoire. And I found that this organization by poem, while very logical, was somewhat limiting. And so to help users to navigate through this ocean of music and poetry, we have also created a browse page, which I find very useful and can also serve as a starting point for statistical analysis or corpus studies more generally. For instance, Francesco yesterday talked about the use of C and cut C in late 16th century repertoire. So here you can very, very quickly see how these true mensuration signs are spread out across the repertoire. So for instance, you may know that we have 551 settings of the rime, and of these, as many as 436 are in C, which is totally expected, but it's nice to be able to give an actual number to this proportion. As another example, a few months ago, I was talking to to Marco Mangani about the modal type F without a flat, which, as we know from theoretical sources at the time, is quite rare, but we don't know exactly how rare it is. So we did a rapid statistical analysis here. It is indeed very, very rare. So out of 550 settings, only 7 are in this modal type. So 1% or so. So, you can find different ways of looking at the repertoire, and by doing so, you may also discover things that apply to vocal music of this time period as a whole. But let's move to the musical editions, because this is not just a database; it's actually an edition. We provide newly made editions of all these settings. And obviously, one of the challenges with a repertoire that is so wide and so diverse also is to come up with sound editorial policies. And obviously, in light of the diversity of the repertoire, you have to be very, very flexible. Of course, you cannot edit a solo song the same way that you edit a polyphonic madrigal of the 1570s. So flexibility is really key, as Rodobaldo pointed out yesterday, also in his presentation. We do have policies that apply to the repertoire as a whole. For instance, when it comes to text underlay, we tend to stick to the original as closely as possible, with the exception of punctuation, of course, and accents, which are terribly inconsistent in this repertoire. But other than that, yeah, we try to tailor the editorial policies to the specific situations that we have to encounter. Now, I would like to point out that these editions that we provide here are dynamic. So what you see in front of you here is not a PDF uploaded to the website. What you see here is a dynamic score. Our encoding system is Humdrum, which is one of the oldest, actually, I think, music encoding system. And we use that because it is particularly conducive to analysis, to the development of analysis tools. And this is repertoire that affords lots of opportunities, especially for comparative analysis. But because, as Richard pointed out, it's essential that we be able to share our data with as wide as a community as possible, also for the sake of long-term preservation. We export data also in a variety of other encoding systems, ranging from very familiar ones such as PDF, MIDI, MP3, but also MEI, which is the encoding system that Richard uses in his projects, MuseData, and Music XML. So we are widely compatible with a variety of encoding systems. Starting from Humdrum and via MEI, we convert the scores into online dynamic objects using the software Verovio, which has already been mentioned in Richard's presentation. And because the score is dynamic, there are lots of things that you can do with it. This is a truly interactive score that creates a different kind of engagement with the users. For instance, just to give some examples here, those of you who are accustomed with printed editions may be puzzled by the lack of incipits, with old clefs, original durations, etc. We don't provide those not because we don't think it's important to do so, but because you actually have the option here to go back and forth between original mensuration, all clefs, and modern ones, simply by clicking on the button O. So you can actually read the full score using alt clefs, which is something that personally I like to do. And you can also print the score as is with alt mensuration signs and clefs. Likewise, for those who might be interested in creating instrumental renditions of this repertoire, there is also the option of removing the text underlay. which you can do in real time, and then print the score with this particular function. You can also extract individual parts and print them out, again, for the purpose of performance. And a new feature that we have implemented not too long ago, at the suggestion of several singers who have been using the website, is a transposition function. Paolo Dacol was talking yesterday about this question of transposition, and you can do that in real time here. For instance, this is a piece that is pretty high, and so perhaps you may want to transpose it down a fourth, which you can do again in real time, and then print the transposed score. Again, singers should be able to do it on their own, but it can be challenging, as Paolo Dacol has pointed out. We of course also have critical notes. This is still a fairly traditional edition in terms of methodology. You can visualize them at the bottom of the score in a very traditional way, so in a static manner. They're down here. But you can also visualize them in the score. You may see asterisks here along the way. Let me find one. You can see this one here. And if you hover over the asterisk, you will see the critical notes. Eventually, we will also encode the variant, the musical variants in there. We haven't done that yet, but it's forthcoming. You probably can't see the pop-up now because Zoom doesn't allow you to visualize pop-ups that way, but they are there if you do it on your own. You may see at the top right of the score, there are several boxes for musical and textual searches. This is the thing that Humdrum is particularly good at doing, so tailoring search tools. And I'll give you an example of a type of search that we have implemented very recently, a search by vertical sonority, which is especially useful for this repertoire, which is increasingly vertical sounding. So this is a piece in F, and for instance, here we can do a real-time search for F sonorities, of which we have 49 in this particular piece. You can also do a textual search. For instance, we can search for the keyword of the piece, which is man. This is a poem about a harp player. So hands are very important, obviously. And here you can see all the occurrences of this word highlighted there. As Richard pointed out, some of these resources are conducive, to both close analysis, so close readings, and also distant readings, and that's exactly what you can do here, because you can also do searches, musical and textual, throughout the repertoire. Here you can see a pre-typed search for the series of pitches, D, C sharp, C sharp, C sharp. And this is a very effective way also finding out possible relationships between pieces, especially pieces on the same poem. For instance, here we see two pieces by Marenzio and Dall'Agostena, who is a Genoese composer, on the sonnet Di nettare amoroso ebbro la mente, and you may see that they have essentially the same incipit. The interesting and puzzling thing is that Dall'Agostena's setting actually comes before Marenzio. So there is a slight chance that Marenzio borrowed from Dall'Agostena, or it could be simply coincidence. But with this tool, you can really investigate the repertoire in many different ways, tracing possible relationships. And eventually we also plan to incorporate in some fashion Richard's tool, which I think would be very appropriate for this repertoire, where intertextuality is so important. One more thing about the digital editions is that they are dynamic, and these ones are particularly dynamic, if you will, because You can actually edit the pieces yourself within the website using a tool called Humdrum Verovio Humdrum viewer. Note that whatever changes you make don't actually get published on the website. We have strict editorial control on what is published, but you can make changes for your own personal use. For instance, if you are a choral conductor and your singers are puzzled by the H here in the vaga, which some singers may, especially in non-Italian speaking countries, they may find it puzzling. You can actually remove it. If you go here to the left, you can see the humdrum encoding, and you can make a change in real time. And then you can print out the score as is. This is really no different than what you would do with a printed edition, where you make corrections with a pencil in your own copy. So again, these changes don't actually get published on the website, but it's a way of enhancing a user's involvement in the website. Quickly, because we don't have that much time, I said at the beginning that in this project we pay equal attention to the musical side of things and to the literary side of things. And also, as I said, typically in critical editions of madrigals, editors rarely acknowledge the very complex textual tradition of the poems setting to music. In our project, we actually provide diplomatic transcriptions of the texts as they appear in the musical settings, but also in the literary manuscripts and prints. These transcriptions are encoded in TEI using a schema that Rafael Villanti has actually developed for us. And this allows also for real-time visualization of the variants across the sources. I'll give some examples. This is a relatively simple one of a madrigaletto by Tasso. I've chosen as a baseline text a version preserved in an autograph, actually, in Modena, the Biblioteca Estense, and you may see that I have highlighted the fifth line of the poem, Anzi ella insieme t'io, which is actually absent from all other sources, both printed, literary prints, and also musical settings. So somehow that line, as well as the following line, have dropped in the tradition. So you can clearly see that composers did not use this manuscript for sure. This is a fairly simple case because we only have a few literary musical sources, but things can get quite complex. For instance, in the case of Non è questa la mano, we have over 40 literary sources and over 20 musical sources. The encoding is very stable because TEI has been around for quite a while, so it's a very safe encoding system. But the rendering is actually quite complex and also somewhat fragile. You can see here that there is quite a bit of information. In this particular case, I've selected it as baseline text, again, an autograph preserved at the Vatican Library. And you can see that I have highlighted the fourth line of the poem, which in this source reads, Ecco pur si ritrova. You find this lemma only in the manuscripts E1 and F2, which are both essentially authoritative manuscripts ascribed to Tasso himself. But all the other sources read differently. So we have a lot of sources that read Ecco che pur si trova. Then I3 reads De pur me distetto, etc., etc. TRM 47A, which is Pallavicino's setting of this poem, reads Ecco che pur la tengo. So there is a great variety here. So what you can do is to trace essentially the history of of these poems. Very often I think that especially non-musicologists who use editions of madrigals tend to think that that these poems are kind of like a given, that they don't have a history of their own, but here you can see that that's not the case at all. So this is a very important tool, I think, and one that I'm very attached to because I've actually transcribed everything myself. So it's been a lot of work, and I hope it will not crash eventually, because there is quite a bit of data there. Just last but not least, I want to draw your attention to the analytical tools page that we have, where you can find different tools for that they basically facilitate musical and textual analysis of this repertoire. I don't have time, of course, to go through all of them. I will just highlight a couple. This is a Melisma Analysis tool. So here you can track essentially the amount of melismas that we have in each piece, and you can also rank all the pieces by the degree of melismatic writing. And then if you click on the highlighted words here, you can go to the score where you can find the melismas highlighted themselves. So here you have quite a few, of course, because this is a piece by Agostini, who was a Ferrarese composer, so virtuoso singing is their thing. Another tool that I find personally useful is the music to text ratio. So it basically measures how long it takes a composer to go through a certain number of syllables. And here I'm tipping my hat to Cecilia, because you can see here Mr. Filippo Di Monte, whose music text ratio is very, very low. You can see that in the left column. It's around 1 or so. In his settings from the 80s and early 90s, he was very quick. He would go through poems very, very quickly with very little repetition. And so he's a very synthetic composer. Again, this is something that you can also verify empirically by going through all the pieces. But I think it is nice to visualize all this data so efficiently. So to conclude, we could say that through its content and through its digital features, this project addresses a wide audience, and intentionally so. And it's an audience encompassing musicologists and music theorists, literary scholars as well, linguists, and performers. And in addition, it provides a new model for editions of Italian madrigals, one that restores the centrality of poetry in this repertoire, even though I still think that the composer-based model is very valid. This is just a different way of looking at this repertoire. And accordingly, this model could be used also for other types of vocal music, ranging from opera to lieder. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emiliano, for your presentation. This is truly a fabulous resource it strikes me as equally useful, equally promising for both scholars and performers. It has so much to offer. I wonder if there are, speaking of now, on the point of time, it's 10:48 in the US, it's 16:48 in Arezzo. I'm told that we can stretch this until 1700, alle 5 del pomeriggio to 5 p.m. And so we have about 10 minutes for questions. And so I invite any of the participants, any one of you who is listening out there, to ask questions or comments for the presenters. Yes, Cecilia has some questions. Please, Cecilia.
Ok. Posso parlare in italiano?
Certo.
E magari
I will
poi...
be speaking Italian. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank all three the speakers because the presentations have really been interesting and fascinating. It's a world which, for those who are outside, for the traditional musicologist, it can maybe be afraid, but at the same time, one realized how huge are the resources, unthinkable with the traditional instruments of the press and the traditional books. And I'd like to ask all three a question, a specific question. For Friedman, I'd like to, I have this question. How is it possible to fill the gap between specialization and language, which is ever more evolved, the ever more evolved language of informatic, and traditional musicology? It's difficult, and often it's difficult to communicate, to dialogue, because we are frightened by the extreme specialization of these subjects. So this is the question for Friedman.
Yeah.
How can we vehicle to traditional musicologists the possibilities of this type of
Is the
research?
question clear for Richard?
I think so. Yeah, you'll see if I answer a different question than you asked, but
Okay.
I will try. Um, the challenge of translating between specialties, of course, is something that, well, if we think about it, we're always doing, right? When we speak to people in literary history, what Emiliano does, the issues and questions that literary scholars pose and musicians pose are from, well, there are different questions. There's different kinds of evidence in each one of these. So we're always doing this. It's not easy, I will say, and it's been a long process. But it's very interesting because in it, in order to communicate beyond your own narrow disciplinary vocabulary, you need to clarify for yourself how you know what you know and what a question might be. Right? In other words, some of this is to ask yourself, what's a musical question would be a first thing to begin with. And then you need to try to begin to understand what a digital question might be. In other words, what is the kind of thing that a machine could pose of a body of information, and how would you articulate that question? And then you need to find the intersection between the two of them, which is, what is a digital musical question? And so you are constantly trying to articulate for yourself, let's say in the context of pattern searching, because this is something that Emiliano was just looking at, right? Well, it's not so hard because computers are very good at understanding strings of characters. If you can represent each voice part as a string of events, you can find patterns within those events. It's not difficult. As Raffaele was suggesting, trying to find patterns that happen across musical parts, which after all, depending on your notation, if your original transcription in the digital edition goes part by part, you will have a very hard time understanding what the connections are among the parts, vertically speaking. If you represent them according to the measures by time, you can find simultaneous events, but other things will not be linked with each other. And so this is a first challenge. And then the second challenge is computers are very good at understanding, let's say, the pattern of F, A, and C, as Emiliano said in his example. They can find that string. But what if you're interested in the interval of a major third followed by the interval of a minor third? Or what if you're interested in just any thirds, major or minor? Well, the one thing that computers are not very good at is ambiguity. Human beings can see diatonic and hear diatonic relationships, computers need to have this explained to them. And so, again, you need to now think about how you would frame this in a musical context and work with your partners to imagine how this might be factored in a digital way. So this is just a small example of the kind of thing that happens with it, but I find it very fascinating to think about what a question might be like within each of these disciplines and find the ways of acknowledging how we know what we know. I hope that's an answer to the question that you posed.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. Invece ecco a Raffaele Viglianti che
To
ringrazio.
Rafael Villanti, who I'd like to thank for having tried to translate in his report what was the whole intent of this Congress, of being able to come up closer to the world of musical practice, which is a true problem. Because still today he was showing, as he was showing yesterday in his Lorenzo Donati was showing his presentation, we use editions of Palestrina, which are very old and which appear in IMSLP or in CPDL in the platforms. So there are projects, this is what I'm asking Raffaele, there are projects in ACT to distribute, to widespread, to get the vaster number of users to reach the projects which we're going on with. Thank you, an excellent question. I think that the situation is a bit complex because the participants are many. There are editors who do this work. It's mainly academic work. There are publishing houses, even if often they work in cooperation with academics and so forth, but in the end they work for profit. And that dialogue has existed for a long time, and it's inevitable in a way. What happens is that the critical editions, which are actually made a bit less accessible because of their cost, but also because of the distribution, it's not very easy to buy a score, especially of pieces which are not very commonly used. And so the digital situation said can facilitate this type of execution and access. And at present, we are at this point in which it's easier, especially for new generations, to use screens to do anything. So we are at a point where we have this opportunity where we can make more accessible the work which we do as editors, and the way in which it's done at present is ad hoc, case by case, and the project of Das Musica in Milan is an excellent example where there's a great deal of complexity and rigor academically, but it also includes, it shows the use of musical practice and the fact of being able to unload versions and print them. This is very useful. But what remains is it's an isolated project, and we need time to create these projects and a lot of resources and a lot of people. So from the point of view of, it's difficult to imagine how this could be then applied in a vast scale to the whole musical corpus that we're interested in. We have to find a midway, and it's essential to begin having a dialogue with publishing houses so that they can begin thinking of a way of digital access which can be more efficient, so that we don't all end up studying on ISM. There are other ways with more rigorous keyboards. And now I have a question. I'd like to congratulate Emiliano Ricciardi because his project is truly a masterpiece. And I was able to appreciate it. My sector of research is that of poetry for music. So it's a project of this type, which is an exception because in time, a number of projects are starting out of musical editions too, and often they stop at a volume or at a sector. And the idea of having covered such a vast repertoire with all of the opportunities of research in a literary framework and in a musical framework is truly, I think, it's the only available just now of this very, very high level. And I used it for in my studies, and I realized that I used only a very small part of these because the question is, we go back to the question that we were asking Friedman, the difficulty of entering these new languages and knowing how to find from a project of this sort all of the information which can be offered. This is the difficulty which I find as a user when thinking of this type of project. So I believe that it is important to do a widespreading in education, a knowledge which is to be ever more detailed of the possibility of this project. And
that one I think Stefano's help with. Could you repeat the question for me, please?
Actually, I am rather vague on that too. I was thinking about I was thinking about practical issue, how to wrap this up. So I have to say I missed the question by Cecilia.
So if I understood correctly, you were asking to do with the practical aspects of helping people understand how to make these digital editions. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
that's amazing that I understood it, but okay. I'm hearing Italian, but I'm thinking French, so it's two steps that I'm trying to make it happen. I mean, this in fact is part of the aim of the CRIM project. It's about bringing experience with making digital work to musicologists, and also bringing musical ideas or the problems of musicology to people working in information science and data science. So in fact, what we do is teach people how to make these editions, and this is through declared methodologies and principles that we try to diffuse to others. And this is something that's also quite characteristic, as Stefano had mentioned, of work in the natural sciences. For a long time, we as humanists have tended to work on our own and then bring relatively finished product for peer review or to editors to then bring it into the public. And instead, what we need to do in a digital context is have declared methodologies and workflows where there's a whole series of steps that we undertake and agree upon the methods in order to produce reliable results. So part of what we're trying to do is to educate. And I should say this is one of the other frontiers that digital work crosses. And I think Emiliano will confirm this, and Rafael as well. That is, not only does it cross the bounds between practical editions and scholarly editions, but it crosses the space between pedagogical work and research work. It's genre bending in that sense. And so what we used to think of as the separate domains of teaching and research are actually very often with each other. And in fact, many of the people who've participated in my projects have been my own undergraduate students who very quickly can learn to do this material and participate in it. And so I teach in order to advance my research, and I advance my research in order to teach better. And I think this is another change that we can all celebrate through digital work, is the connection between pedagogy and learning. And I think that's something also, given the foundation that's sponsoring this event, that Guido would have appreciated.
No doubt about it. Thank you, Richard. Yes, I think it's safe to say that the next generation of scholars who are essentially are born with computers will be more at home utilizing this technology, this fantastic technology that you are developing to the fullest. But for now, it's already quite inspiring, I think, to see the way in which your project invite us to think differently about scholarship, about what kind of questions we are asking, as you say, Richard, and how and it's also wonderful to see the amount of data that puts at our disposal at a click of a button to answer those questions. So um, uh, I think the impact of these resources is definitely enormous, and we can only see that this will change the way we think about scholarship and editions in the coming years. Um, I'm mindful of time. It's 5:05 in Italy, and we have a roundtable coming up in about 25 minutes. Yes,
Sì.
Cecilia?
No, volevo chiedere appunto a Ricciardi quali saranno gli sviluppi futuri, cioè
I want
come
to ask Ricciardi what the future developments will be, how he thinks he can widespread knowledge of this project in the vaster field of musicians and the executors.
In italiano, diciamo in italiano.
I'll speak Italian.
Sì, diciamo
Well, yes,
l'obiettivo appunto
the objective
adesso che poi
and
è quasi finito, dico quasi perché di fatto
now that it's
sono
nearly
molto
over,
di questi
the
oggetti
problem
digitali
of these
ormai
digital objects is that they're not
sempre
always
ampliare,
really finished because they can always be
modificare.
made vaster and modified. One of the
Sì, di
objectives
favorirne l'uso
of favor
a
use
tutti
at
i
all levels,
ricercatori
both for
e
experts and
secondo me soprattutto
is
degli esecutori, perché
for
uno dei
those who are
problemi che abbiamo
executors,
nel
because
mondo
one of the
del
problems we
digitale,
have
per
in
esempio
the world of
qui
Madrigal is
noi di fatto
that
non
we, in
abbiamo questa
fact, don't
musica nella
have this music in our
abbiamo
ears.
pochissime
We have very little
registrazioni
recordings,
non sempre di qualità,
not
tra
always
l'altro. Per
quality
cui
recordings, in
credo
fact.
che questo
So,
progetto è anche un po' un
this
invito
project is an invitation
ad
to
eseguire questa musica
carry
così
out
che anche
this
noi
music
esecutori
so that
possiamo
we
semplicemente
experts can, we
ascoltarla. Ecco,
scholars
questo
can
è
listen to it.
stato fin
And
dall'inizio
that
il
is why
fine,
we've tried from the
rendere
very beginning
fruibile
to
a un
make it
pubblico vasto, certamente musicologi, studenti sia
usable
musicali
to a
universitari,
vaster
ma anche
public,
o
musicians,
soprattutto
but
gli esecutori.
yes,
Quindi
especially musicians, those who execute the music, because this music is to be listened to.
certo, e anche nell'ambito dei
And
letterati è
also
importante perché l'abbiamo visto insomma anche
for
nel convegno
literary
a
experts, it's
Tasso
important because we
dove
saw
sono
in the
state
Tasso in Music
il convegno
project, the
organizzato
congress that was organized, we
l'ambito
saw how
letterarie
the literary sources,
cioè no, quanto l'ambito
how the
letterario
literary
avrebbe bisogno
ambit would
del
need
supporto delle fonti
support
musicali,
of
no? Per
musical
una
sources
conoscenza
for
migliore
the
della
better knowledge of
strumentazione, insomma.
Sì,
tradition of
appunto
Tasso. Yes,
l'obiettivo anche di
the
questo progetto
objective
è
of this project
di
is
mettere insieme un
to
po'
put
questi
together
mondi che non si
these two
parlano molto
worlds
spesso
that
per
don't
varie
speak to
ragioni,
each
perché
other so
ognuno fa il
often
suo
for obvious
lavoro,
reasons, because each one does their own, each one
ma
does his
diciamo
own
che anche il
work.
problema è che
We
per
have
esempio
the
in caso
problem that
Tasso
as far as
io
regards
da punto di vista
Tasso,
delle cose
the point
letterarie
of view
è un tale una
of
situazione
literary
talmente
approach is
delicata
such an
che
intricate
se si aggiunge
situation
anche
that
la
if
parte
we add
musicale si
the
pongono delle altre
musical part,
questioni vanno di matto, diciamo. Però
it'll
bisogna
be
farlo perché
difficult, but we
appunto
have to do it
il lavoro
because
musicale è importante
it's very
e alcune
important to
volte
have this musical
può far
part,
capire
and sometimes it can help
bene
us
gli
understand
spiriti
certain
letterari. Ecco. Quindi
exquisitely literary
diciamo che
phenomena.
questo tentativo che
So
finora
we've made
sembra
this attempt,
essere riuscito.
which seems to have
Spero che si
worked,
possa
and I
replicare su
hope that it
altri
can be
repertori, diciamo, analoghi. Mi viene in mente il caso di
replicated in
Paganini,
other
per
repertoires. I'm thinking
esempio,
of Padini, even if it would take a
Words
lifetime.
of Petrarca. Sì.
The words of
Abbiamo
Petrarca.
già nel
Petrarch, actually, in
iniziato,
2004, I'd
aveva
begun.
fatto un
We
archivio
had
digitale
made a digital
e poi il
archive,
progetto
and
si
the
è
project was
concluso, il
concluded.
sito non è stato
The
aggiornato e
website was
quindi
never updated, and
è
so
morto.
it died.
sì, tra l'altro, se posso dire una cosa che
If
in
I
questo
may
lo
something,
vedremo anche dopo, che questo problema
This problem of sustainability, the term is very serious. It's not the question of codification, which has to be stable and used by a large number of people. It's also a problem of the scholars involved, because I realized day after day that, in fact, I'll be tied to this project for the rest of my life, because it's not a book that one can set aside, say it's printed and that's it. No, one always will need somebody to keep updating. So it's a problem, and it's a challenge. It's interesting from this point of view, but it's a serious commitment. Something I hadn't realized at the beginning. Something I said, okay, let's go ahead and do it, and then and instead it's not like that. It's like a marriage, long term. Thank you to all three.
Very good. Are there more comments or questions from the audience? If not, I would like to thank our three speakers, congratulate with them for the wonderful resources they have realized that are of great interest for for a broad audience out there of scholars and performers. Thank you again for presenting the fruits of your labors to us this afternoon, and we are going to reconvene in about 20 minutes for the roundtable. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Rodovaldo e regia di Firenze, siamo
Ci sono.
è tutto a posto con come coordinare i canali di... Siamo...
Sì, è tutto a posto.
Come coordinare...
Allora, aspetta che sento un eco di ritorno.
Sì.
Ok.
Da parte nostra è tutto a posto.
Ok.
Da Firenze.
Quindi chiunque voglia prendere la parola può farlo
Sì,
facilmente.
attiva il microfono e va in onda.
Ok.
Bene.
Una domanda, rimaniamo con le telecamere attive oppure parliamo solo quando interveniamo, attacchiamo anche la telecamera?
Potete rimanere con le camere attive.
Ok, solo il microfono spegniamo quindi.
Sì.
L'importante è che il microfono sia spento, sì, sennò può esserci il ritorno.
Cosa facciamo? L'entrata diretta col microfono aperto chi vuole entrare o il meccanismo della mano alzata? Boh, possiamo anche fare direttamente chi vuole interviene, al massimo
Ma
si
sì,
sovrappongono e...
siamo adulti e vaccinati, quindi...
Tanto nei consigli di dipartimento succede così, quindi
Sì.
ecco, che 3 intervengono contemporaneamente, per cui... Già è così brutto questo sistema. Poi, per carità, per fortuna che c'è, che almeno si riesce a fare qualcosa, però...
già.
Però...
Possiamo procedere quindi alla seconda parte della giornata di
Okay,
oggi.
let's start with our second part of today's session with the roundtable. Our chairs will be Stefano Mengozzi and Rodobaldo Baldi. The participants will be all the speakers. So Paolo Dacol, Lorenzo Donati, Richard Friedman, Walter Marzilli, Ingrid Pustianaz, Emiliano Ricciardi, Francesco Saggio, and Raffaele Viglianti. I would like to now give the floor to Rodobaldo Tibaldi, who is going to introduce the roundtable for us. Thank you, Cecilia. Just a very brief introduction. Also, to recap the main topics that we talked about yesterday for those who weren't here yesterday. We are here except from Philippe Vandré. Unfortunately, in his absence, unfortunately, will not allow us to sort of answer to his questions, because also at the beginning of my speech, he went away, unfortunately. So I don't think it's correct to answer to the speech of someone who's not here today. I just would like to say something because I really felt involved in this, and one of the topics that I think would be interesting to be to deal with was the works of Gesualdo, and he as the responsible of the Gesualdo Online, and I as the one of the members of the scientific committee of Gesualdo edition, online edition, that has been published under three universities. So University of Pavia, University of Calabria, the Istituto Italiano of Musicologia as well. We're all together, and we all offer three different perspectives. So I thought it was great that we could meet up and talk about it. The interesting thing was that only the Gesualdo Online was mentioned, and some of the features were presented, and some of these features are actually not even online, because some of the features that Vandré talked about are not actually available online. And other initiatives like the new Gesualdo edition was not mentioned, even though he is in the new Gesualdo edition. So the situation was a little bit particular. Was he left yesterday? I don't think it's correct to talk about it today. Also, out of correctness for and for correctness sake for those who are present here today. But I thought maybe it would sound strange to talk about this new Gesualdo Online with someone who is part of the scientific committee. And the sort of rival part was presented, that is the new Gesualdo edition, was presented without sort of any questions asked. But anyways, we can move on to our roundtable. We have two main aspects. First of all, anything that had to do with philology, music editing, and some aspects about music editing. These aspects were very generic, but also kind of stretched out, because thanks to Ingrid's contribution, we also dealt with all the different resources from the 1900s, and also digital resources when it comes to digital and textual resources for the music of the 1900s. And that was done on purpose, because we are virtually, at least in Arezzo, in a foundation that has a very long standing choral tradition, and anything we can do is really to deal with these relationships. So digital philology, digital sources for musicology in that sense, plus the performance practice. And since on the YouTube channel, it's stated as a workshop, that's our workshop, and that's something we would like to continue for the next few years. And I think this is a great occasion to start this workshop. So the relationship with the performers, I think there was a misunderstanding at the very beginning, because the relationship between philology and performance practice, it was actually thought out as an addition that would bear this very important name, and then all the uses coming from these additions to be put into context into an historically informed framework. And I just would like to mention the Francesco Luisi's essay, where he talks about stylistic awareness when using certain types of additions, so critical additions, for example. So a final result of historically concreteness, so therefore using the right correctness for the historically approved text. I had raised that question, and I had raised that problem also during my speech about who is the recipient of all these editions and who is the target of these editions, what kind of musician that is, because we cannot have just one answer. I mean, we have different musicians who use these editions of several different degrees. There are specialists of the 1500 musics who have specific needs, who are expecting specific answers, but we also have amateur choir conductors, and there's nothing wrong with it. And also, they use these repertoires. So the conductor perhaps is expecting another answer compared to the specialized philologist. So that's why we wanted to make the practical, the most of the editions practically usable, just like Lorenzo Donati has highlighted yesterday, considering also the variety of different versions that can be found online. Considering this question, though, I think we should answer to other questions as well that we can totally talk about today. I mean, I know I'm putting a lot of things on the plate in that sense. So, for example, another provocation is that the edition for practical use is most of the time transposed. And it's transposed in ways that are very far away from the original one. But the modern singer is very strictly related to the height that he reads onto the score. And sometimes this new transposition is too high for the choir that he's using. I know that this transposition is absolutely legit, but sometimes it's not adequate. So this could be one of the topics we could talk about. And if this Congress itself can help the academic, the scholar, and the musicians to increase their knowledge, my question is then, what kind of musicians are we targeting? The topic we started talking about yesterday about the practical use of the music of the 1900s was also underlined under several different aspects when it comes to the new Gesualdo online. And these aspects have been highlighted in today's presentations as well. So as far as I'm concerned, I just would like to now give the floor to Stefano Mengozzi to sort of complete my introduction, my very brief introduction to this roundtable, and we thought it was a lot easier simply because of digital problems. We thought that if there are any questions or anyone who would like to speak, he or she can just open the microphone and start speaking. I know that some voices might overlap, but then we will solve it live, basically. So I know this is not my role, but off to Stefano Mangozzi. Thank you, Rodobaldo. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to listen to the Congress yesterday. So I just would like to. Unfortunately, I cannot draw the complete conclusions of what it was talked about between today and yesterday, but I totally agree with Rodobaldo. Who are we targeting? So, what musicians are we targeting, and why do we do these editions for? This is a very valid question. We're also facing the situation for, well, I live in the United States I've been living in the United States for a while, but in Italy, I think it's a matter of arising the interest and to really stimulate the interest in the audience, because most of the speakers here are interested in this, and I think it's a matter of working in a very specific direction. And I'm not saying anything new, because right now we have extraordinary resources, just like we saw in this morning's session, and these resources allow for the performance and the digital world to meet halfway, basically. And I think the problem still lays in trying to increase the number of people interested in the audience. So I know I'm saying really trivial things, but the new generations are the key. Because I think you will always have different types of editions, and we'll have to accept that ILMSLP and CPDL are not going to disappear magically from tomorrow on, or in a fortnight, because maybe they're not adequate, they're not correct, or and so forth. I mean, they will always play a role, I think. The problem, though, is just raising awareness among the different performers, the different scholars, that the sources and the resources that are out there are incredibly valid, incredibly reliable. So these are just parts of my comments. Just these are just some thoughts, and I just would like to now open the debate. So if you have any questions. One thing, Stefan, I totally forgot to say, because for you is morning, but here it's almost 6, but it's basically dark. And in Paolo Dacol's speech, who talked about the chiavette clefs in the Venetian repertoire, he talked about a very interesting thing that is mainly about addition. I talked a little bit about before, and he observed it from another point of view. So whenever we have sort of problematic situations, so in in scores that have been edited with high clefs or clefs that are not considered vocal in the vocal field. The question is, do these versions have to be transposed, or can we find a mixed way? So I'm thinking about all the Magnificat or the Jerusalem of Monteverdi and so forth. And I was actually thinking about it this morning. It actually poses another question, because if we start from the assumption that the theory tells us, so theorists of music manuals and those who are not practical of music practice, the only transposition we mean is just the fourth and the fifth, because that's the only ones we have available. But also Patrizio Barbieri reminded us that a transposition could be also to the third with an automatic change in clefs. And this would automatically bring a Roman motet of the 1600s to be transposed with all the flats and the sharps of the case. And I think it's a very interesting case. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if we were still in the 80s, where there are 3 people only who are doing the editions of Monteverdi, we would finally solve the issue. But unfortunately, we are in 2020 and everyone is working with editions and anyone can publish them. So I think that the question, it doesn't really make sense, unfortunately, because right now we have transposition of all kind. We have Palestrina with a major E flat, and I don't know. I don't know if it's a bad thing or a good thing. The point should be educational. The question is to allow the public and the audience to understand what the different contradictions are and what are the uselessness of a Palestinian transcription with 5 flats on one side, and on the other side, for example, we have a very amateur choir that can use these sources and might find them incredibly useful. If the alternative is not to sing Palestrina, I think the debate is pretty open.
Qualcosa.
Can I say something?
Posso
Paolo
intervenire?
Dacol? Yes.
Buonasera a tutti, o
Well,
buongiorno
good evening, everybody, or
del luogo
good
in cui ci
morning,
troviamo.
according to where we are.
Direi che il problema è un po' del quale un po' riferivo ieri, cioè la flessibilità che avevano gli antichi rispetto alla nostra rigidità, no? Per cui la varietà di diapason, la varietà di risorse da una sede ad un'altra. Noi abbiamo bisogno di standard, questo è un po' il nostro problema, e quindi di riferimenti molto chiari, molto precisi, per gli antichi, come è stato molto bene poi esposto anche da Walter ieri nella sua relazione. Sono tante invece, è un mondo molto più complesso, ci troviamo davanti a un foglio di musica che sostanzialmente è un foglio di musica da rivestire, da tradurre in suono con una serie di operazioni che per gli antichi erano, diciamo, assodate in molti casi, almeno per i cantori più esperti, e per noi contemporanei invece si tratta di ricostruire appunto una serie di prassi, di abitudini. Credo però, riguardo al discorso dell'edizione, appunto quello a cui Rodovaldo accennavi, cioè il fatto che, ad esempio, io non credo che si tratti soltanto di decidere se appunto rendere una partitura in chiavi alte appunto
transpose
nella
a
sua
bar
sede in cui sta
with
scritta oppure
higher
nella sede, diciamo,
keys
conveniente per le voci,
in
ma
its rightful
sarebbe
position
bello
or in the position
poter,
that it's more
appunto,
convenient
gli
for
esempi che
voices.
sono stati oggi presentati sono
But I
veramente
think
molto
that
interessanti,
with all the
soprattutto
examples we saw today,
nella
I think
relazione
it's
di Emiliano.
very, very interesting,
Il
and
fatto di
especially
poter
in Emiliano's
trasporre con
speech,
facilità una
the
edizione
the
digitale,
possibility
ecco,
to
senza
transpose
questo,
so easily a
mi
digital
chiedevo ieri
version
come si potesse
of
fare e la
a
risposta in
piece.
qualche modo è
Yesterday,
arrivata
I
oggi.
was
Naturalmente
asking
siamo
myself, how could
molto
I do
lontani
that? And
da
today I
questo
got my
traguardo,
answer.
che
And
lì
I
è stato
think
realizzato
nowadays we're
evidentemente
still
con un
very
progetto
far away
che ha
from that
impegnato molte
achievement, from
persone e
that
con
goal.
un
And
concorso
your
di
project
risorse,
was
di mezzi, di
incredibly
menti che
big and entailed
realisticamente e
the effort
pragmaticamente
and the
in
work
questo
of so
paese,
many
in
people,
Italia e
uh,
anche in molti
and
altri
also
luoghi è
the
molto
use of so
difficile
many different
realizzare.
economic resources
Ma
that
certamente una
in
soluzione
Italy
di
would
quel
be very
tipo
hard
è davvero
to implement.
vantaggiosa, nel senso
But
che
resources
può
such
fornire per noi
Emiliano's one
moderni che non
are
sappiamo leggere, non
incredibly
sappiamo
advantageous
trasporre,
for us
può
modern
fornire una
who are
partitura
not
in
able to
qualsiasi tono,
transpose, and the
quindi
fact that
naturalmente
we can have a score
io
that
sarei
can
molto
be
infastidito
transposed
da
in
un'edizione
whatever tone.
con 5 bemolle, ecco, di una
It's
pagina di
great.
Palestrina e non
I
riuscirei a
would be
leggerla, ecco,
particularly annoyed
neanche
if I
credo
had 5 different flats in a
i
Palestrina score.
cantori e i
I wouldn't
cantanti
even be able
che
to read it.
lavorano con me o
So,
insomma in
and
molti
I
altri
work with a
casi,
lot
cioè
of
coloro
different
che
singers, and I
insomma
know they agree
praticano
with
questo
that too.
repertorio sempre,
So
ma
even though
certamente ecco,
they're much more expert than me and
un'edizione
they
di quel
practice
tipo
this
risolverebbe tutta
repertoire
una
way
serie
more often than I
di
do,
problemi
but
anche
using a
riguardo
resource
al tipo di musicista che deve
like that
eseguire
would
quella
solve
musica,
so many
insomma.
different
Quindi
problems,
è
also
stato
for
molto
musicians
interessante
who need to
conoscere
perform
quella realtà.
that music. So it was very interesting to getting to know with that resource. If I can intervene, Walter Marzilli. Well, maybe we should find an agreement and divide the musical world in two, even though it's pretty brutal. But to make the reading of the score more convenient and more, maybe we should leave the professional choirs to read the perfect score, the untouched score, with maybe a flat or two, and then allow maybe the amateur choirs to sing with 4 different flats. I don't know. Maybe they could find a less dramatic solution of 3 flats. I don't know. How about you lower it by a half step and you just write it in C, or you write it in F? And then it's up to the conductor to see all the different textures and transpose it, maybe a half step or a lower of a half step. So if these scores are targeting amateur choirs, why are we putting 5 different flats? Well, but it could be useful for the performer, because the choir can totally sing without any sharps or any flats, but maybe for the musician, it would be useful to have the transposed version of a mid-tone or of a semitone or a higher and lower. Well, you know that there used to be organs with the automatic transposition. Just below C there was an F, so it was very easy to transpose. Right now we don't have them anymore, so it's a little harder. But I mean, Palestrina doesn't need any musical score in that sense. If I can join what Walter was saying, because I had the opportunity to work with several different choirs, both amateur but also professionals. And to be honest, I had more difficult in working with original parts with professionals than with amateurs, because in the professional world, unless it's a choir that's specialized in this type of music, that could be the ensemble of Paolo da Col, the professional singer, I'm not talking the opera singer, even the singer who just studied music as a whole, when he's given a score, this is Secret Service, you see an F, but you should sing in C. The singer goes nuts because, and with amateurs, sometimes it's even better because they learn it by heart. So you can tell them whatever you want, and they're going to sing it. So I think the difficulty here is actually to educate conductors. And I was lucky to study in Arezzo with Francesco Luisi in the 90s, and it's already been, what, 25 years ago, and has been many years also with Waldemar Zilli, that we had scholars who have studied musicology a lot and have been collaborating with conductors a lot. And I think we started educating them to be more aware of what the ancient signs meant, and all the secrets linked to those signs. And so also the reading of ancient manuscripts and ancient prints, at least in Europe, because if we move away from Europe, so for example, in many choirs from Asia, I know that there are still many difficulties related to that, but I've seen those who organize concerts from European choirs, and they use these types of scores. I've seen big improvements, and most of them, for example, use digital scores. Most of them are correct, and I would say that a lot of this digital material is actually very well made. As we were talking about yesterday, the risk here lies in what is presented and how. So to make sure that at least it has a good critical version, and a critical edition, and because sometimes from internet we find versions that very stealthy, have been copied here and there, from one file to the other, and this leads to a lot of confusion. It's true that most of the times we have really good quality materials. So I think the difficulty nowadays is to really educate the performer through the conductor, and the singer through the conductors, to choose the right thing. I speak to my students a lot about when we exactly like when we speak about food, for example. I mean, when you go to the supermarket, sometimes it's hard to choose between so many different types of Parmesan cheese or similar types of food. You can choose well if you are educated about it, or you've studied these things. Obviously, here I'm talking to experts, and musicologists, and not just that. I think it's important to teach our students and to teach the conductors and the experts about what's genuine. And sorry if for someone it's already lunchtime, maybe that you feel already a little bit hungry. Well, in the US, we don't have a lot of types of Parmesan cheese to choose from. I mean, in Wisconsin, Iowa, they can forget about it. No, but about besides the transposition, there's also the issue of reading from the score or from the different separate parts. And I think that's a very important difference, because if you stimulate the singer to sing only that part, then you kind of encourage him to actively hear and to force that singer to notice all the differences. Yes, by the way, I had this experience when I was studying in Rome in the 70s. I remember we were given the separate parts to sing the polyphony, and I still remember this burning desire of wanting to know what was happening around me. And maybe I had my small part by Palestrina, which was splendid, absolutely beautiful. And also the fact that I was supposed to enter after a couple of pauses, and I was a little bit puzzled because I didn't know what the others would do before me, unless you have absolute hearing, even though in singing for choirs, absolute pitch or absolute hearing is not necessary. Um, but I really wanted to know what the bass would do, what the altos would do, and it's still troubling me. I'm still not sleeping at night. Whereas now with the entire score, it's easy. It's an historical false, unfortunately. I mean, the so-called librone was not made like that. I really don't know how, as we talked yesterday, to rehearse till a certain point, like the choirs in the past, to rehearse at one point and then start from that point without getting lost. Oh yeah, about what Mengozzi said, I think it's actually very the hearing part is very interesting. Like asking ourselves how musicians back then used to hear and used to listen to these pieces, because I think to us it would be extraordinary. Besides the new parts, the new edited part, I think it would mean that we could really study how they used to listen to these pieces and what kind of approach they had, because to sing in that way, I think the singers had a totally different responsibility, and it was more nowadays it's more related to the visible aspect more than the hearing aspect. So I think we would also understand the sense of limitation better, starting from the sense of listening. So it would be interesting to investigate this, and I try to do this exercise with my students in Trento, and we always stop at the second line of the staff because we just cannot continue. But it's a very interesting exercise. Well, the orchestra players, like they play like that. The hornet player doesn't have the violin part, so I think it's more a mindset.
I want to bring the example of a musicologist, not of a practical musician, if possible, because this is something that I also wrote in an article. It's very important that critical editions also have detached parts, because in point of fact, as Maestro Marzidi was saying before, the score is a historical false from many points of view, which we we can't do without, but it isn't necessarily the only plausible solution. The detached parts would be very important, and I mean by detached parts, modern parts made in a detached way, not facsimiles, because this is a problem that we can't go into now. But certainly it is important. They are difficulties which we have found, and the problem is the modern musical formation or training. That's the problem, because we are used since we were children to read those beats, to read scores for piano where there's the song and the accompaniment. So what is the formation that makes us understand how difficult it is to go beyond the the second staff. So for those who are specialists, I think they could solve it. I don't think it would be a problem. So in my opinion, it's a very important aspect because with by detached part, I mean parts that are detached that don't have the beats written in the modern notation, but without beats, because the beats influence very much the melodic dictate and the construction, the mediation between parts. And so I have made some experiments, and I've also published them as an essay, not to be carried out. And so this is a stone I'm throwing in the lake, in the pond. The detached parts are really very important, and I think this brings me to say something else. We talked about amateur choirs, which certainly are important in the musical panorama, but when an editor or a philologist builds a critical edition, he can't think of making a critical edition for amateur choirs, because the critical edition has a historical aspect of research, which is purely musicological, and then there is an aspect. So in neither of the two aspects can be ignored. And it's very important that both these aspects be considered in an equal way. I've been doubly fortunate because I was a bit younger and I had the possibility of singing. I was able to sing in these critical editions. I was able to sing them under the under Ingrid, who was my director at the time, and it was very important for me to experiment directly a critical edition, and this also in other cases. I go back to what we said yesterday in the various. When I was singing with Ingrid, very often we could compare notes. She is a practical musician, me as a specialist in mensural signography, how certain pieces were to be carried out and how the transcription could keep in mind this reality. And I'm thinking of the musicians who know more about this than me, the problems that proportions provoke, the passage from proportionate to non-proportionate times. This is a great problem, and talking about it together without seeing that a practice it become more important than theory, because it's a solution which works in practice might not be consistent with theory. So it's important we're here in a round table, musicians and musicologists. It's important to find a point in common, even if we each keep our specificities. And I think that it's also important to see this concept go by, that a good execution passes also through a good addition. And I'm not only referring to how faithful the dictation of the text can be, because sometimes the minimum variation might not mean anything at all. But if we think of the achievement of a dactus, how is it translated in a menture, in a mensura? This can change a lot if we think of the mensura subdivided in 4 or subdivided in 2. So the addition counts a lot also also to obtain a good execution, and that is why it's very important to find a point of connection between the different parts, different ambits which are around ancient music. It's very important, as Ricciardo is saying, that this music be executed but also listened to, so we have a double responsibility. We have Richard Friedman who's trying to take the floor. He's been trying to take the floor for some time now, so I think we should give him the floor. Richard, you have the floor.
Oh,
ecco, okay.
I'm sorry. I've said quite a bit today already. I guess thank you. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Anyone else who is not speaking, please mute yourself.
So the one thing I would say is I think there's an ethical dimension here that we need to consider in two senses. One is that people will find digital scores online through Choral Music Library or Googling them or finding scanned editions. That's not a problem. We need to, I think, use the power of these encoded editions to cultivate a sense in people of the work that goes into producing them. In other words, that we can think about people becoming aware of choices that are made, editorial interventions, how texts are formed, and that there need not be a divergence between, on one hand, a scholarly edition and a practical edition. As Emiliano has shown us, digital editions can be transposed, we can remove or add, we can show or hide editorial interventions. And so I think the image of there being two sets of editions is one that we don't need to pursue. And the reason I think that there's an ethical dimension to this is that resources are not what they were. The prospect of having a publisher edit, print hard copies, sell them, and actually recoup the investment for this is a very difficult thing to imagine. And I think there's an ethical responsibility for us as scholars both to bring the products of our scholarly work to as wide an audience as possible, but also not duplicate each other's work. And so I think then combining that with the idea of people becoming aware of evaluating the materials that are before them. The problem today is not a lack of information, it's a lack of an ability to evaluate information. And this is what we've seen in the public sphere everywhere, where false claims, fake news, people not evaluating information correctly has been exactly what has threatened our societies. And while music might not matter that much, I think that scholars have an ethical responsibility to show our work, right? That's what people want to see. Show your work. And we can use the digital editions to both show our work and make it available in ways that people can actually put it to use and can adapt it and participate in it. And I think if young people will have a sense of why a scholarly edition matters, it's because they want to see it there. They're not willing simply to accept the authority of Stefano or Emiliano or others who say, this is my edition, I'm an expert, take it. Right? They want to see it. And so I think this is why these ethical imperatives point us towards the continued collaborations of the sort that we've mentioned around digital text. And now I'll be quiet.
Thank you so much, Richard, for your comment. I wonder, vabbè, magari parlo in italiano. Mi chiedo, qual è il problema?
I wonder, what is the most urgent problem in Italy? The problem is that there are amateur choirs which are not sufficiently prepared, or else that there are no amateur choirs. Well, the first thing you said, Professor Mengozzi, there are amateur choirs which are not prepared. But I must say that the team of directors is maturing greatly in these recent years, and maybe Lorenzo could speak better than I can as director of the School of Arezzo. And a very well-prepared team of directors is coming up, and they will have to do positively with the quality of choirs. Yes, I can say that in the last 20, 25 years, the situation has changed. I don't think that before this wasn't happening, because as Walter was saying, we were studying these subjects, but ever more we have assessed in schools, in the conservatory and at the schools for the director of the School of Arezzo, studies went on. Of course, they're not the same studies at such profound levels, which can help these musicians to to discern between the different conditions, but they all study the possibility of transcriptions and interpreting signs. Let's say that on certain aspects, the music, the proportions, the comparison, collation of sources. I'm sorry, the sound is going.
che esce dall'ambito
So it's outside of the ambit of a conservatory to make discerning in this sense, but the growth does exist, and the cantors themselves who sing ancient music, those who are specialists, are ever more studying directly from the sources. And this is something which is very interesting. The cantor, the singer of Renaissance music, who studies in the conservatory, who is doing studies at university, evermore is able to read music from sources and therefore also has the possibility and attraction of reading the new critical editions and the course, the pathways and the various courses of the at university level. Can I take the floor for a moment? Yes. I think, and I agree fully with what has been stated by Professor Friedman. I believe that we ought to see that we make known for directors of choirs and at schools, we make known this novelty, the opportunity that dynamic editions offer, because the awareness of the awareness of choices is multiplied in these editions. And as long as a student finds himself with a score which is done, he doesn't realize what is behind this fact that this finished score. But once through the digital instruments and through these new projects, he can understand that at that moment we have a number of variables, a number of variations, a number of possibilities of achieving the music, the musica fitta. At that moment, the student or also the director of the choir understands that it's not the score or the musical edition which is something which is forever. This is one aspect. And the other aspect of these projects is the accessibility. Open access has to be the future of culture. And I think that we see that there are many critical editions, like the new Gesualdo edition. The limit is because of the fact that it's very costly. The price is very high. And here I involve Tibaldi. Who can afford to buy an edition of this type? It's 400 euros, over 400 euros, a volume of the new Gesualdo edition. Or else do we then favor photocopies and pirate photocopies from libraries? This is another problem, which is solved by projects like Tasse Musica, which freely put at the disposal of others music in ancient editions. Well, if I were a president of Albert Writer, I could give you a response. Since I'm not, however, and I'm sorry not to be so, because probably this evening I would be on holiday instead of being in front of my monitor, like my referent who of be a writer who left the other day and is coming back January 11th. But it is a big problem, and especially today with the ever greater necessity to defend at all costs the cultural, um, what is cultural. So this, which you say, is a relevant problem. Um, it could have to do with at a level of price, not use, for the new edition of the works by Palestrina, because the prices were anyhow sufficiently high, not as high as those of a writer, but there's a whole different order of things, which of course we can't give an answer to, and we should look at this. But there is a basic problem which Richard Friedman has talked about, which is the fact that it is important to see the basic preparation. We have to teach how to use certain instruments because the instruments can't be used critically because nothing gives a priori guarantee. There is no guarantee if there is an online edition, just like there is no a priori guarantee in a critical a printed paper edition, traditional edition. We have to know how to assess things. We have to understand what we're seeing, what we're reading. And that's why this was maybe what I was most keen on yesterday. When we talk about addition, we talk about an overall operation, not only transcription. An addition is something which involves many other aspects, including the instruments to understand the nature of the operation. In what we looked through before regarding digital editions, there was the aspect of apparatus, introduction, and so forth. Except that, and these are fundamental aspects to understand what we have in front of us, which is not only understanding the quality of transcription, which I repeat is one of the aspects of the edition, only one, but understanding the cultural part. What instruments do we offer for the understanding of that object, which will become an object for sound, as a witness of the past, as a cultural witness of the past, a witness of the culture of the past, exactly like the Dante's Divine Comedy or Leonardo's Gioconda. So it's to be welcomed in all of its elements. The executor will be interested because he can't because the musical interpreter can't only be interested in translating into sounds those signs. The interpreter tries to have an overall understanding of the whole, and clearly his task is not that of the musicologist or philologist. That's why he has to address others and understand the importance of the whole. Yesterday, I gave an example of the new critical edition of Bach's opera, the Neuer Bach edition, which exists since 1954, where it says clearly in the introduction, not in the critical apparatus, in the introduction, it says that that edition is useful also for executive practice, but to understand that volume which contains only the transcription, the musical edition, we need to use the other volume containing critical apparatus. And the critical apparatus is not only the list of the variations or of mistakes, because variation and mistakes are not the same thing, which is to be found in the various witnesses, but also a part devoted to the history of that opera, to Genesis, how one has reached the various versions. That is an addition. Nothing else. So the transcription is a part of the edition. And if we keep on reasoning only on some of the parts, we'll keep on talking on our own of just some subjects. But the visualization we've seen today is a clear visualization of the intellectual process, because the critical part is a cultural operation and a different system. We're only at the beginning, and so we need to reflect upon different things. We have to re-intervene. This is the good thing about the use of informatic resources, so we can constantly make an intervention. So certain aspects will have to be looked into. Again, from my point of view, I belong to the category of traditional musicologists who, as I was saying before, deals with these new possibilities. So I try to understand what is to come next. But the dynamic edition, as far as I've seen it, as it's been presented today, and as I've seen in certain projects of an international nature, is this visualization of an intellectual process, which can be seen in itinerary to understand the problems involved in a different way from the traditional way, which is endowed with a critical apparatus, critical apparatus which comes from its name, what we consider, what yesterday I called the place where the variants and mistakes go. It's a very important instrument to understand the work that the editor does and also the history, the path of the text. And that is why it can become even more of a problem if we look at the situation. And here I look at certain other aspects that Mazzilli went into before regarding the specialists who need a clean score without any type of intervention of thick music. It depends on the period. If I have to do with the polyphonia of the 1400s, of the early 1400s, I'll have other problems. So I can't have only that situation from the graphic point of view presents problems. The dynamic edition is the following, if I've understood. It's a decision which allows me to see in itinerary the history of a text, the transformation of a text, the changes of a text, or else maybe only simply how an editor was particularly bad in endowing it in a new in a new edition and many more mistakes. I don't think it's what was said yesterday. The dynamic edition is what presents a number of variations, which as far as Gesualdo is concerned are only mistakes, and then allows in a creative fashion to those who read it to choose one variation or the other to construct a monstrum which has never existed. A sort of a delirium of omnipotence, so that the reader replaces himself to the composer, to the creator, without, of course, having the valence of a Mahler or a Wagner, who wanted to do something completely different. It helps us to think in a different fashion. Of course, the problem of fruition of the cultural wealth is an authentic problem, and there's no doubt about. Can I say a few words at this point? I have some comments to make. Um, we said a lot of things on different levels, and I want to try and organize my thoughts, starting from my experience as a director of a choir. That's a job I've been doing for 15 years. I was part a bit, as Lorenzo and Walter knows, we've done things together. Also in the training of directors with UCID, with Feniarco. So there is I was militant in instruction and education at different levels, because actually we had to do with choirs and parish churches where the director was maybe an organist who suddenly became a director, down to very refined projects with an historical awareness of very high level. And it is right that it be so. I think that this is something we should never forget. Like Stefano was saying, reality is this, and it would be wrong to imagine that one could expect an approach, a different approach at all levels, at the same level from all of these different realities.
Having said that, there is a second issue that you've all raised, and it's a matter of education and training. Training a choir conductor or a chorister, I don't think it just means to train someone and teaching them how to correctly read a score, whether it's critical or one of the worst versions ever downloaded from Petrucci or whatever. I think it means to train people through with the help of several different tools, that is historical tools, cultural tools, that whenever they have a Palestrina score, they don't perform it as if it was Bruckner. And this is a matter of musical culture. I mean, there are some choirs who still perform Palestrina in a different way, but I think it's important for it's important to know what the conductor knows and what the choir was trained to do. So I think it's very important to know what kind of cultural intervention we apply. So I'm totally in favor of supporting choral approaches, but also raising awareness in all these professionals or amateurs. So I just would like to really sort of marry this digital cause also from my experience, even though I come from a different field, because we have a research project um, with the University of Strasbourg on the musics of Gheorghe Ligeti, and there we have educational projects that would help the performers to perform the trio of Ligeti correctly. So we worked in a team in that sense to give a correct interpretation of the score and put it in the right cultural context. Therefore, also adding some videos, for example, performers who have worked with the author as well. So helping everyone who will take a look at such a multimedia project to be able to acquire, thanks to all the different resources, a both a philological awareness in terms of gestures and vocality and so forth, but also in terms of performance. And just like Richard was saying before, I think the role of the conductor is incredibly important and really makes us aware of our choices and how complex these choices could be. But I think that anyone who wants to make that choice should have the right tools to then make that choice in a socially and a culturally informed way. So I think that we have this responsibility, and also the digital world has this responsibility to create projects and to create these sort of cultural products in inverted commas that are totally complete. So they have a 360 degrees completeness. So just like all the materials that we as musicologists have access to. I'm sorry if I spoke for a long time, but I totally agree with you. But I think that our role is very important, but it's even more important to work as a team, because alone we cannot do it. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. What you touched upon was musical dissemination, and we know exactly what it means for Italy, unfortunately. So yeah, you definitely touched upon one of the key points here. Because among specialists, we totally agree with each other, we collaborate and everything, but whenever we are faced with non-prepared people or non-educated people, and that's good, the responsibility is even higher. You cannot mock music, and it becomes a moral duty, and a lot of people don't think that. So, for example, there are even some experts that work in radio stations like Claricetti in the Ticino canton for Switzerland, or Dixon in England, who are incredible experts. If we go back to Italy and we hear what we have, I think we still have a long way to go in terms of musical education. It's also a matter of a constant a constant exchange between specialists, and also about knowing what kind of skills and what kind of knowledge everyone has. But again, maybe I'm speaking about utopian things. I don't know. I wouldn't speak about utopia. I firmly believe that working as a team is fundamental. And one of the reasons that also encouraged me to put this Congress together involving also Stefano Mengozzi and Rodobaldo Tibaldi was really the intention to create this exchange of knowledge and exchange of backgrounds in order to really create a complete product, even though I don't like the word product, because all the different knowledges and the sources we get from the digital world should finally get to a much broader audience. A lot many more students should know that and should finally get access to that, because it's part of of our future as well. And knowing the edition, the different steps, the different critical editions, and what happened in the past, perhaps it's not enough. It's very important also to know the entire cultural context that work stemmed from. So, and as Rodobaldo was saying, unfortunately, the risk is that we all stick to our little to our field and we don't collaborate with each other. This sometimes is the biggest risk, and I think knowing the needs and the knowledge coming from also different fields and different disciplines is very important. So all the collaborations between the Fondazione d'Arezzo and the School for Choir Conductors and everything we're doing, I think could really be interesting and useful. Thank you, Cecilia. Even though at the same time I find maestros Marzilis and Maestro Donati's comments very useful to realize that there are choirs that are very educated. The question is, what can we do, we as scholars and also as the foundation of Guido d'Arezzo can do to improve that and to make sure all of these things we talked about happen. I mean, there are initiatives that we could use and we could really implement to foster this cultural growth. Stefano, I think that we could have several different initiatives, just like Professor Rodobaldo Tibaldi said, in terms of dissemination and in terms of spreading out these studies and all these materials to those who are interested. And there are occasions such as this Congress, this symposium, that will become a yearly event, just like it was in the past. But there are a lot of choir conductors and choristers from both from the professional world and the amateur world who come together. So, for example, one is the international contest Guido d'Arezzo that has been running for 68 years. And this contest puts together both the amateur world but also the professional world. So Odecaton, for example, has participated together with other professional groups, together with a studies pathway, studies curriculum that brings together 30 different scholars and together with students all together once a year to study all these things. I think that we should really support the studying of these materials that are mainly critical editions, also available online, and that propose a different interpretation of the text. And just like Rodobaldo was saying, they propose different varieties. It's true. But an online text could have different interpretations from the musicologist's point of view, from the several musicologists' points of view. And I think it's important. I think it's important for the musicologists to not just to feel and discover the sound in the so-called economic sound of these texts. And I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about the fact that they should understand that maybe investing a little bit of money to get a higher quality text could be beneficial for not just them, but also for the choir they are teaching to or they are conducting. So in that sense, we have to improve our efforts, because I think we need to, what we propose has to be very efficient. It doesn't have to be quick and easy. It has to be accessible. So that's why it's so important to meet and to find these meeting moments, because for a musician it's so much easier to just go online, find a score, download it, and then share with his or her choristers. Instead, if we manage to create a network, but not even just a network, just some meeting points, some meeting occasions to talk about what we've been studying for years, because those who are studying a certain cultural pathway need to meet those who actually then put that cultural pathway into practice. So I think at that point it becomes economically advantageous, and maybe not again from the money point of view, but from the energy point of view. And I think that Arezzo really wants to be the starting point of all of this. And with Cecilia Luzzi, we'll definitely do our best to create these meeting points and meeting occasions, and really support the choirs of the future, because we will probably use some versions that might be shared with you. If I can intervene. Yes. Of course, these editions that are the fruit of years and years of studies of someone who was absolutely an expert about, cannot then be broken by choirs who use contraltos, women contraltos, instead of altos to sing Renaissance music. Even though kids not always were used in cathedral choirs to perform these pieces. So just like Ingrid and Lorenzo and others were saying, it's so important. It's paramount to choose the right cultural context, because again, we have the triangle: conductor, choir, and score. If you move this triangle, the triangle becomes an abstract figure, and it doesn't work. And it's always better to act upon the conductor and the performer, obviously, because using a different registry for Palestrina or using the covered voices, I think it destroys all the most critical voices and the most critical versions. But I wanted to use this occasion to really shed light on a very important aspect that Professor Tibaldi talked about yesterday, because I've lived through the same exact situation. And I'm going to be very practical. So the altered note together with the non-altered note, I think you mentioned a Magnificat by Paolo Retini. There was a F sharp together with another note, and bird has the same thing. You have a F sharp that lasts for one tactus plus an F natural, so a natural F that continues, and I've tried it myself, and I must say it's not ugly. It's actually doesn't sound too bad. I find it actually enriching, just like the varietas that is often mentioned in Renaissance books, where sometimes we live in the apparent false relationship in the Picardy when we have F sharp and then a natural F afterwards. A lot of versions consider it as a false relationship between the two notes, but I think it's actually an enrichment. It's actually an added value because each voice is performing its S chord, and together you have a normal B and a B sharp, for example, together. I don't know if you share the same thing, but the two lines and hexachord basically create the contemporaneity of these two notes together. Yes, this is very fitting actually, because the example I showed you yesterday, precisely because of that, I did it not to show you a solution, but to show you the problems you have whenever you need to interpret the musica ficta according to how certain theorists of the ancient times used to do, or like for example, the expert Vacone would do, because the descending alteration with the flat would keep its meaning, whereas the ascending alteration would have to change. We have all the tradition of the polychoral and bichoral music. With on top of one choir, we have a second choir at the major third. For example, they enter at the major third. But if I were to mention one case is Gambert. Gambert is full of situations like this, and it's derived from so many different situations. So, for example, the use of transposition, like with the hexachord, the combination between the real hexachord with the fictus hexachord, and also in more modern cases, in many situations like Gesualdo, if we look at them vertically, they're totally illogical. If we look at them horizontally, they are logical. Also, the typical progression C, D, E, F, G, it's totally bulletproof, basically. So there are no alterations possibly. And I'm mentioning all the work by Margaret Bent when it comes to the oral corrections during the rehearsals. The point is always the starting point. Obviously, there are some exceptions that we can explain in several different ways, and it might sound weird whenever we try the score by Palestrina when it was written in one way or another. But I think when we have the horizontal part, it's pretty clear. Or the Monteverdi Missa in illo tempore, if we analyze it horizontally, it's perfect, except from the continuous bass that it's used pretty much everywhere in a writing for 6 voices. But anyways, we're talking about something completely different. Yeah, also in the Vespri by Monteverdi, there is a G and a G sharp altogether. Yeah, because the pathway is actually has multiple steps and it could be overlapped. No, but the case from yesterday, it was not a correction, but it was just a situation that could pose problems and it could have been solved under several different aspects. But again, we don't have one version, and it's always better to try and propose new solutions that maybe 20 years later will not be valid anymore and that we will need other solutions. And we're here for this purpose, otherwise we would have to change job.
I think it's very promising to consider the idea of
organizzare questi
of organizing this activity between directors and experts in occasion of the polyphonic, and Arezzo is an ideal position to create this sort of thing and to bring these people together. And I hope that one of the results will be to think about concrete activities to be brought forth in that direction, because it would be great for everyone. We would have everyone would have something to gain. It is the right step to take. And also considering widespreading music at a higher level, it's very important because it's the right thing is not to kid people. A workshop that illustrates it to the directors of the choirs a certain type of a problem, correlated problems, and the various additions that could solve this problem. Something that I've thinking of now, it would maybe be something to consider, but there are other activities that we could think of. I think that with Cecilia we can take commit ourselves to organize the competition and the polyphonia in the hope that we be able to do it next year, that all COVID problems be solved and over, and to have a convergence on an Arezzo in the this polyphonic competition, and to have these many important musicologists come to Arezzo so that we can set up a series of initiatives to go deeper into these aspects, and especially to widespread the at a high level, at top level, because if we form students for choir directors, and if we update those who are already in activity, if we do it with some professional cantor or with some good instrumentalists, we'll get good results. And I don't think these people at this point will dash onto the internet to see things that they can get so easily. Well, Lorenzo, it's and I say Lorenzo and all of you, you know what maybe the real problem of directors is. It's that they aren't interested in these things, because if you look, I clicked on YouTube now on the public channel, and there are only 7 people connected, and I don't even know if there are. Well, no, Walter, this material remains on YouTube, and we thought, as Alfredo Vantini was saying before, that we do a newsletter where we summarize the content of this meeting. We send it out to all the choirs, and yesterday's session has already been seen by 350 people. Fine, this is good news. I'm very happy about that. Things might have gone on a bit at length, but if we remain on the internet and if we get the initiative, we make the initiative known, certainly there will be more visualizations and more knowledge of the work that has been done today and yesterday. Well, the fact that it remain on the internet will we make it widespread in the future. Not that I don't want this situation depreciated. It's a wonderful situation and it should be widespread, disseminated all over. These are problems which regard all directors. Now, many were quite specific, but they are problems which regard directors, their growth, and the growth of choirs. Thank you, Lorenzo, for the proposal of integration. I'd like to ask Ingrid. We talk about the ancient repertoire because for many reasons it's much easier to digit a madrigal of Monteverdi rather than a sonata by a waltz by Chopin. Oh, are there projects? Is there any project to any avant-garde projects or things that are in the making on the digital channels regarding what is more modern and contemporary? If I can take the floor quickly, just to give an answer to Stefano, since Chopin was mentioned, one of the famous projects is OCB online Chopin editions edited by Professor John Link, done in cooperation with the Department of Humanist in Informatics in King's College London. The idea of setting up a variologist edition without interventions or with minimum interventions by the editor, and to show especially not only the manuscripts as sources, but the reeditions of Chopin, because he published them in different moments, but close to each other, and in different countries because of the different problems of copyright and with minimum differences. They're all approved by Chopin, so it's very difficult for an editor to choose one or the other. And the online version makes it possible to see these variations, these variants, and to think whether whether to interpret them in different ways, to take certain parts from one edition, others from another. They're all by Chopin. So it's a very interesting resource. And one of the differences is that it was done using images which are recomposed. The online interface can be explored in different ways, but it's not easy to construct a text which can be reprinted for the performance. It remains, however, an instrument for preparation for students rather than something which can be used. But it's a good example to be considered.
Sì, ecco, non so se appunto stavamo salutando.
We were saying goodbye to Richard, who is off, who's leaving us. Yesterday, I spoke about the other side of the story, the projects which are not yet critical digital editions, because I talked about composers who are still alive. And what are the questions of a philological and editorial type, which in the introduction of digital, which what does it add to these intricate questions? And of course, there are certain projects, but I'm talking about the second half of the 1900s, because so there are projects on Luigi Nono, on Giorgio Ligeti. There are projects which cannot be configured yet, like that of John Vinke, which is obviously connected with a performance study, so it's something very vast indeed. Project with Beethoven House. So in the second half of the 1900s, which is what I deal with, the questions are many, very complex, and of course the digital could help in putting at disposal a multidimensional space that Rafael was talking about. That is a truly important idea, and potentially it is a creative space where we can truly put in a lot of information which can be read can be consulted by very many different perspectives. And so it is a type of attitude that we're all developing. It's not easy to imagine that we organize the data that we have at our disposal in a multidimensional space like that. I did these projects on Ligeti, on the trio with 10 pieces, there too, from the analysis, the additions, the sketches, the different clickable editions. I think that these standards are going in this direction, and they're slightly different issues from the ones that we've dealt with. And so I don't want to move things onto a different subject right now at the end of our session. Yes, but I was just wondering if there are aspects at a technological level which could be shared between projects of different types. The ways in which a project can learn or derive benefit from what one has learned from someone else. Well, of course, the question of encoding, for instance, is something which at this point in time is vital for everyone, because it's something I'm not much of an expert, but from what I've been able to understand, the teamwork is useful because it helps to think ahead of time of the result with levels of branching off and ramification and fruition, which are to be very specific. And this truly is a project which can be taught, whether it be Bach or Chopin or Beethoven or Tasso, because it is at a level, at conceptual level, that we're at the very beginning. We can't even imagine a musicologist who cooperates with an informatic who is doing encoding of a certain point. He doesn't even imagine. And this actually, in the future, is something we have to learn how to share. So maybe we'll become a bit quicker, a bit faster.
C'è un problema, se posso dire, nel nostro paese,
There is a problem in our
in Italia,
country, in Italy,
perché in pratica non c'è
because in
nessuno che si
practice
occupi
there's
di
no
music
one who
encoding,
deals
cioè
with music
a
encoding
livello, diciamo, tecnologico,
at a
appunto.
technological
E
level.
c'è un
And
interest group
there is an interest
a livello
group
europeo che
at
ha
a
sede a
European
Paderborn,
level. It's based in Paderborn,
ci sono ogni tanto
and sometimes
delle
there
riunioni
are
appunto
meetings
dei convegni sul tema
on
appunto del music
the theme
encoding,
of music
che
encoding.
sappiamo, come è stato
And
detto
we
anche
know, as has been said,
poc'anzi,
just a
ha
while
delle
ago,
possibilità enormi. Ad
it
esempio,
has
so
huge
che si lavora sugli
possibilities. For
scritti
instance, I
appunto
know that we
di
often work
Beethoven,
with
appunto per
sketches
trovare poi naturalmente
by
delle
Beethoven, and
concordanze
then
tematiche,
we
perché
find theme
l'MI permette delle
concordances, because
ricerche
MEI allows
tematiche, che ad
thematic
esempio potrebbe
research,
avere degli
which
sviluppi
could
enormi
have huge
nell'attribuzione
development in
di
the
musiche anonime, ad esempio,
ascribing of
no? Con gli
anonymous
incipit,
music
con un confronto tra incipit.
with
La ricerca
a
appunto,
comparison amongst incipits.
so questo perché
And I
in
know
qualche
all
modo abbiamo
this
cercato
because
di
one way or
usare
another we've
questo
tried to
music encoding
use this music
per un
encoding
catalogo
for a
tematico delle
thematic
opere di
catalog
Tartini a
of
Trieste,
the works of
però
Tartini in
il programma
Trieste,
si chiama
but the
Mermaid,
problem is called Mermaid,
come è stato
and
sviluppato a Copenaghen, non
it
a
was
caso,
developed in
ma made
Copenhagen.
appunto con MEI.
M for MEI.
E naturalmente questo programma poi adesso non riceve più finanziamenti dalla Biblioteca Reale di Copenaghen, non ha più finanziamenti, quindi praticamente è morto. Noi abbiamo cercato di sviluppare, abbiamo sviluppato questo software con il supporto di alcuni informatici, però utilizzando gli incipit in formato di PDF e non MEI come sarebbe auspicabile fare, e quindi questo darebbe un senso al catalogo tematico. Se si riuscisse in Italia, ecco, a livello accademico, in qualche contesto, cominciare a lavorare su questo e trovare delle forme di collaborazione tra appunto, musicologi e informatici, diciamo, in questo settore, potremmo forse arrivare anche noi a risultati ai quali che ci hanno appena esposto da Emiliano, appunto ci ha raccontato, con un tipo di edizione digitale che ha molte possibilità, compresa appunto, si è parlato di parti staccate, anche quella di fornire automaticamente parti staccate e così limitare un po' questa nostra visione appunto verticale della polifonia e aiutarci a vederla più in direzione orizzontale, diciamo, imitativa. Comunque, insomma, questi sono altri discorsi, ma questo è diciamo la nostra grande mancanza, quindi rende davvero un'utopia in questo momento lavorare in questa direzione nel nostro paese.
It's so difficult in our country just at this point.
Altro lavoro da fare.
More work to do. I was told that we are we are to close the session. We are to conclude. Have you got any message in this sense? Well, it's past 7 p.m. in Italy. That we're being asked to close the session. So just a very brief remark. It's a theme which is very dear to me, and it's something we'll talk about in the case of Chopin is well known because I knew that's the website, but we'll have to be careful because a variant should not be just signaled. It must be understood, and the risk is that one mix up the different variants. Of course, every case is a case in itself because philology teaches us to reflect and not to give precise rules. It's one of the risks, in my opinion, which could take place if it falls in the hands of people who are not expert on the subject. So since we are in conclusion, I'd like to thank everyone, all of the participants in the round table. It was very lively, very stimulating, much more so than it could have been, because the subjects all seem to be apparently too specialized, but instead we've touched upon many different points, which yesterday seemed to go beyond the main issue, but there are many branches and we followed them, and it's very interesting to do so. So if there is an interesting branch which has not been foreseen, it's interesting to pursue it, and this is what we've tried to do thanks to the stimuli of you all. So I want to thank all of the participants, and we hope that there will be a way to repeat the operation soon in presence, of course, hoping that the situation will be solved soon because it's becoming heavier and heavier. Thank you, Rodovaldo, and thank you, Cecilia. Thank you for all the work that you did in coordinating, all the hidden work you did. Thanks to all of the participants. I want to thank Raffaele and Emiliano for the participation in the previous session, and also those who've left, and thanks again for your cooperation. Thank you.
Grazie a tutti. Grazie a tutti.
Arrivederci.
Grazie.